Tonight, we begin to uncover a body of knowledge that was, in fact, stolen from its African creators. Indeed, it is a stolen legacy. This is the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston. It and the Washington Monument are structures known as obelisks. They were constructed in the early part of the 19th century to commemorate Revolutionary War heroes. Africans in an ancient land that they called Kemet were the first to construct obelisks of solid granite over 170 feet high. They were religious and scientific instruments. The obelisk could be used to determine the meridian for astronomical calculations and as an accurate shadow clock. An African-born mathematician named Eratosthenes used an obelisk in Kemet to determine the radius and circumference of the Earth. Here's how it could be done. By measuring the shadow of an obelisk of known height, the angle of the sun can be determined. Then, traveling a known distance, and measuring when the sun is directly overhead, as evidenced by the absence of shadow, suggests that proportion which can be easily solved for the radius and circumference of the Earth. This milestone in history demonstrates that African technology was advanced and thorough enough to prove the Earth was round long before Columbus made his voyage. Good evening. I'm Natalie Christian. Our purpose here tonight is to begin to set the record straight about the contributions that Africans made to what we call modern civilization. As the title of our show implies, Stolen Legacy is about some of the advancements made that were in fact stolen from their African creators. We borrowed our show title from a book of the same name by George James. To help us begin to uncover this knowledge are two people who have spent a great deal of time and energy researching and gathering data on what these contributions were and their impact. My guests are Dr. Asa Hilliard, a national authority on African history, the former dean of the School of Education at San Francisco State University. Dr. Hilliard is currently the Callaway Professor of Urban Education at Georgia State University in Atlanta. He has developed many educational programs on our topic tonight. He has lectured on the subject and has taught seminars as well as published numerous articles. Also here is Samuel Matthews, a math teacher at Boston Latin School for the past 6 years. Mr. Matthews attended Rutgers University and is a graduate of the New England Conservatory of Music. He is a member of the Teaching About Africa Institute in Chicago and has lectured on the subject of African mathematics. Later on in the program, we'll be taking your phone calls so you can ask your questions of our experts, and we'll be offering a list of books that you can read to find out more about those African contributions. So stay tuned. Welcome to you both. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
We need to first of all find out about Kemet. Sam, tell us, what is Kemet?
Well, Kemet is the African name for what is generally known as Egypt. Kemet, from the hieroglyphics, KMT, there were no vowels in their language, means black crossroads or black village. If you go to World Book Encyclopedia, you would have that interpreted as black soil.
Okay.
But Kemet is what is commonly known as ancient Egypt.
All right. Asa, what kind of civilization was this? I mean, we know it as Egypt, but it was not Egypt. That's another name that was given to it by another culture.
Right. I think it's important to keep the chronology straight while we're talking about the title. Again, the name is Kemet, K-M-T, and in the Medidnetur, which is the name for hieroglyphic, Greek people changed the name of the writing system to hieroglyphic, but Medidnetur is the appropriate name. There's a plural determinative right by that name, and there are two little people sitting by it. So Kim is the strongest word in the Kemetic language for the word black, and when you put two people beside it, you're talking not only about the black soil, but also about the black people. This is a nation that got its beginning approximately 3,100 years before the birth of Christ, and it is a civilization that lasted intact for approximately 3,000 years. No other civilization on record has lasted that long. In other words, the cultural continuity of the nation was 3,000 years long, taking it, in fact, longer than 3,000 years because it lasted until after the time of Christ. The important thing about it, in response more directly to your question, is that it was the first of the fully developed high technical civilizations that are still on the record. Now the Kamites themselves actually referred to older civilizations further south in Africa when they turned to the south and faced what they called the Holy Land, their home. They said they came from upriver, at the source of the river, to be specific. And they talked about there being older civilization, and they were children of that civilization. But what's important is that when Kemet appears in the human record, it appears in 3100 BC with a fully developed civilization. Writing was already in place. Astronomy was already in place. They already had the 365-day year calendar and 1 quarter for the leap year and all of that. That calendar had actually been put in place around 4236 BC. So we're talking about a fully developed, high technical civilization.
All right, well, let's talk about some of these technical advances. One of the things that we talked about in the piece earlier, Sam, was the mathematics and how it was used. It developed to a point that they knew that the Earth was round. What other concepts in mathematics are we talking about here? Well,
it's true. You certainly wouldn't want to determine the circumference of the Earth unless you had, of course, presupposed that the Earth was round. We want to point that out. All of the mathematics that we study today has its roots in Africa. We can start off simply with counting. The very first or the oldest known artifact in mathematics is the Ashango bone. That's over 8,000 years old. It's from the Congo. That's found in Africa. If we go ahead, they had developed fractions. Furthermore, they had developed algebra and, of course, geometry, trigonometry, and it even gone as far as the roots of integral calculus. And this is all before Europe existed.
And we're going to be taking a look at some pictures, some slides in a few moments, but while they're getting those set up, what about the sciences? Beyond the mathematics, what other kinds of advances are we dealing with here? And Asa, you can jump right in.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is to know that the upper province of Kemet was referred to as Chem. That's spelled C-H-E-M.
Okay, why don't we take a look at that? We have a map of that. Go ahead, Sam.
And that's the root of the word chemistry. So that's an indication to us that the sciences of the earth were first studied there in Africa.
Okay.
Medicine as well.
Right.
The ancient Kemites were known throughout the ancient world as the best of all doctors. Homer tells us that, as do many of the Greek historians.
Sure. Asa, now, of course, I think a question that I have, and many people have is, how did they develop this? I mean, where did this knowledge come from?
Okay, the best, and we have to speculate on this, but some things we do know is that in Kemet, you had an unparalleled opportunity to be scientists. In other words, you have land that has regular cycles that work almost like clockwork. Every year the flood came at the same time, receded at the same time. You had a clear sky. You never had clouds. You had an unparalleled opportunity to observe stars. You had the need, for example, to develop mathematics in order to be able to lay out the land again and divide it among the people after the floods had receded. You had a religious orientation in Kemet whereby the people had a respect for nature through intensive study of nature. And having done that on the same spot, in other words, these were not nomadic people, they were sedentary people who had been on that same spot for thousands of years, which again gave them the opportunity to notice certain kinds of regularities in nature. So as from what we can determine, they spent a great deal of time in botany, in observing the stars, and observing the animals and so forth. So they had tremendous technical knowledge of all of these things, and out of that technical knowledge then flow the sciences, the arts, and literature.
Sure. And now some of those symbols, Sam, we have adopted in our own culture today. For example, the dollar bill. There are a number of symbols on there, and we're going to look at some pictures now, which in the Kemetic context, and how they have gone from that to what we know of today. Sam, what are we looking at here?
Well, if you look at the top, that's the Eye of Horus. That's also found on the dollar bill. The scarab beetle there with wings.
Yeah.
That was taken for the U.S. seal as the eagle.
Mm-hmm. Can we move on? Mm-hmm. All right, now here we see the differences in the, or actually the same symbols.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting as to why those symbols find themselves on the back of the dollar bill.
Why those symbols?
Well, that's because the history of Africa is intertwined with the history of Europe. Mm-hmm. And as late as the early 19th century, Africa was still being studied, though in secret. And this is a result of masonry. In fact, the term mason itself is a derivative of the African language, the Kemetic language, Ma, which means true, and Sin, which means brotherhood or builder.
Now, those are the symbols broken down.
Now, the eye...
They mean something.
Well, the eye itself is actually not the hieroglyphic, the hieratic symbols for fractions. Mm-hmm. As I said before, they did invent fractions, and symbolically you can see there that each fraction has its own part for the eye, and they total 63 over 64. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, it's always interesting to see those symbols because I don't think too many people understand what they really mean and why they were adapted. Anything you want to add to that, Asa?
No, you notice that the eye actually sits at the peak of the pyramid.
Sure.
Every pyramid had a capstone made out of black diorite, I believe the material was. And on those capstones, frequently, they would actually have the two eyes of God. You know, that particular eye should have been the right eye, which would be the sun, symbolizing the sun, as one eye of the Creator, the other eye of the Creator being the moon. But you notice that on the dollar bill, you combine the symbol of the all-seeing eye of God with the pyramid itself. So you have not just one, but two of the African symbols in a part of what Americans treasure most. And those will only be the beginning, because we're going to see more symbols besides not just the pyramid and not just the eye, but you'll see filtered into American culture and Western culture all of these symbols that come off the African continent.
Well, what other symbols
well, the Tenkanu would be another one, which you call the obelisk. The Greeks, remember now, the Greeks changed the names of all of these things that Africans had, so we know them now mostly by their Greek names. So the Greek name for what you call, let's say, the Washington Monument is obelisk, but the Kemetic name is Tenkanu. And that would be another example of something that's been borrowed, in large cities all over the world, major cities all over the world, have they've either stolen actual obelisks or Tenkanus from Kemet and set them up, like in New York, in Central Park, and the Vatican has one. And when they couldn't get real ones, they manufactured them. They're supposed to be out of one single block of stone, but they had actually manufactured these things and put large bricks to make them up. But that would be one other example of another symbol that was taken over. The cross is another symbol, the Christian cross. Initially, the Christian cross was actually the Kemetic cross, which we see as the cross of life. It's the cross that has a little hole in the top. And then later, it changed from the Kemetic cross to the cross that we now have today.
Very interesting. Well, we'll be talking more about those symbols as we move on. We're going to stop here and take a break, and we'll be right back. Stay with us. Kemet was founded by the black populations from the heart of Africa. As such, today's Afro-Americans can identify and take pride in this great civilization in the same way Europeans can look to ancient Greece or Rome. If a typical Kemetic citizen lived in our society, he would be called black or Afro-American. One sees the faces of their royalty in our contemporaries. Menes, the first king in history. Zauser, the first to construct pyramids. Queen Tai, mother of Akhenaten. Had they lived in one of our southern states before desegregation, they would have been forced to the back of the bus. If they lived during the early 1800s, they would have been slaves. This was the dilemma that confronted the West when the faces and glory of Egypt poured into Europe and America after Napoleon's campaign in 1797. What civilized people would enslave the first civilized people? The process of denying an African origin for Egypt and civilization began. Ancient writers, many of whom were eyewitnesses, concur that the Egyptians were African and were founded by the people from the interior of the African continent. They also confess that much of their own culture was African. The Parthenon, a standard of Greek architecture, is a replica of the Temple of Luxor, where many came to complete their educations. Greeks seeking knowledge and wisdom traveled far to study geometry, religion, astronomy, and Africans. The rulers of the 25th dynasty, founded in 800 BC, hailed from Nubia. They revived Kemet's classical period in 600 BC. Most notable was the construction of the smaller pyramids. Most remarkable is the fact that this technology and these people reached what are now the Americas and influenced the building of civilization here.
All right, one of the main points here that we need to perhaps bring out, Ace, I'll start with you, is that this culture was in effect stolen from the Kemetics by the Greeks. The Greeks went to Kemet to study, to find out what was going on with the world.
Right, well, okay, let's, again, it's really important to keep chronology together. The first Greek that we have on record is Homer, and that's approximately 850 BC, if there was such a person. Many literary critics suggest that there were many people and their writings were collected together and then given the name Homer. But be that as it may, at that point, Greek people were not actively involved in the educational system as far as going to school in Africa. But starting around the time of Thales, which would be in the 5th century BC, Thales went to school. We have records of the Greeks themselves. These things are in standard history, so what I'm saying is not a mystery. Thales went to school, came back, advised Pythagoras to go to school. Pythagoras went to school in Africa, was taught for 22 years in Africa. We know the subjects that he taught, that he studied. We know the location where he went to school. We know the name of his major professor. Following Pythagoras, other pre-Socratic Greek philosophers began to go to Egypt for their education. Plato went to school for 12 years in Egypt. Aristotle moved his school when Alexander the Great, his pupil, conquered Egypt. He moved his whole school to Egypt in order to be closer to the source of Egyptian knowledge. In fact, the habit by Greeks of going to school in Egypt was so ingrained, and they valued it so much, that they say that even people who had not gone to Egypt to study would make up biographies to pretend that they had gone, because you had very little legitimacy if you hadn't actually gone to what at that point was the center of higher education in the world.
All right, Sam.
Yeah, well, the Greeks saw a good thing and they took advantage of it. They recognized that the knowledge and wisdom to the south of them was greater than theirs, and they went there to study. But what we have to do is recognize within our culture what is African and what came from Africa. In the previous piece, we saw there the Temple of Luxor and the Parthenon. Now, I have taken pictures of the Temple of Luxor and shown it without identifying it to people and asked them, what do you think you see there? And invariably I get the answer, the Parthenon, I see something from Greece, or I see something from Rome. But very rarely does anyone say, this is possibly Africa.
I think we have another picture of that that we're going to take.
Yeah, so what we have to do is...
That's the Temple of Luxor. That's not the Parthenon.
That's not the
Parthenon. Dating on that, by the way, is approximately 1300 BC is what you're talking about. For the Parthenon, you're talking about around 500 BC. So this is almost 1,000 years older than the Parthenon.
Okay. Any other points there, Sam?
Yeah, about Pythagoras. I think that's one person in particular that we should take a look at, because he has been given so much credit for things that were actually African in origin. He's been given credit for the theorem that bears his name, a squared plus b squared is c squared. But it should be known that that was known 2,000 years before his existence. And furthermore, we have evidence from papyri that the Egyptians also knew about rational numbers, and they credited numbers as having values, things with having values, and Pythagoras is known for that, but indeed he went there as a student.
Let's take a look at this next shot. It's someone that we should know, but that we don't know. Yeah. Sam, who is this person?
That's Akhenaten, an 18th dynasty pharaoh. That's the same dynasty that Tut was from. In fact, he's a relative of Tut. What's important here is to look and see that if you use your eyes, you see a man of African descent. However, if you see artists' renditions of Akhenaten, it's rare. In fact, I've never seen one that actually displays his African features. So that's been taken. Moreover, to indicate to you how the historical and the academic community has stolen, you'll take a look at his lips, and people will tell you, or have told us, that his lips are puffy, not because he's black, but because he has a disease. And then furthermore, they've gone further to actually come up with a disease. Unfortunately, the disease that he supposedly had would render him sterile, and we know that he had 7 daughters.
All right. And this next person, let's take a look at her. This is Queen Ty.
Yeah, that's his mother.
Okay.
And, as we can see, she possibly suffered from the same disease.
Asa, what was significant about Queen Ty?
Well, of course, Queen Ty, this is one of the queens in the 18th dynasty that you have records in Kemetic of Greek people coming to pay tribute to her. You know, in other words, there was a contact between Greece and between Kemet, as not only as early as the 18th dynasty, but in Greek legend it goes back almost to 2000 BC. But that particular woman, she is the mother of both. She is the mother of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Some people suggest she may be the mother of King Tutankhamun, or as we call her, King Tut. But she was also very special because she was not just a sit-at-home queen. It is written that she was a co-ruler with her husband, Amenhotep III, so that the two of them are pictured in some statues as sitting side by side. Usually when the pharaoh is shown, the wife may be standing behind. In the case of Ramesses, the wife is made small and even standing by his leg. But in the case of T and Amenhotep, they're seen sitting side by side of equal height, which has
equal partners.
Equal partners in the ruling of ancient Kemet.
Well, was this unusual at that time where women did rule?
Well, in Kemet you had women in ruling positions, which means that you can look in the cartouches. The cartouche contains a royal name, and only kings or queens could have their names in a cartouche. If a queen also had a Horus name, in other words, not just a royal name, but the Horus name says that you were the ruler indeed, then you would say that she ruled the country. And so there were many of the women who did, but the one that is most famous is the Queen Hatshepsut, because she was in the same 18th dynastic period as Akhenaten, and her beautiful temple is now in the Valley of the Kings. It still can be seen as one of the most magnificent buildings ever built in the world, still studied by architecture students all over the world. And that is at the request of Queen Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty.
All right. We're going to stop here and take another break, and we hope that we're bringing out some questions for you that you may have on your mind, because we will be taking your phone calls in this next segment, so stay with us. We'll be right back. My guest, Sam Matthews, now will tell us about the African presence in the New World. Sam?
The African presence in the New World did not begin with slavery. 2,000 years before Columbus, Africans were shaping the course of civilizations that would later be known as Aztec, Incan, and Mayan. This work of art is found in Boston's Roxbury section. Its creator, John Wilson, was inspired by similar works of art he saw in Mexico. These striking stone tributes dispel any theory that does not place blacks in the New World not only before Columbus, but before Christ. They date as early as 600 BC. Note the Ethiopian black braids. These monuments are concurrent with the Kushite 25th dynasty of Kemet. They were erected by the Olmecs, a civilization which is the foundation of the Aztec, Incan, and Mayan cultures. The colossal stone evidence is supported by numerous figures from the Olmec and subsequent cultures in ancient America that insist upon an African presence. Their attire and broad features leave no doubt as to the origin of the subjects. The pyramids produced by the ancient Americans were indeed influenced by Africa's own. Even today, strong currents off the coast of Africa will sail any sturdy vessel to the Caribbean. Vessels such as Queen Hatshepsut's obelisk boat had been constructed in Kemet 700 years before, clearly demonstrating the maritime ability of Kemet. These constructions have been shown to be sturdy enough to make the transatlantic voyage. When Columbus returned to Europe after his second voyage to America, he reported that the Indians had told him of blacks who had settled in the area. It's true. Africans came first to America not as slaves, but as masters of science and technology, influencing the civilizations that Columbus and Cortez were to find.
Little note here we'd like to give you. If you're interested in finding out more about the legacy left by the ancient Africans, we have a list of books that we can offer you. You should just send your inquiries to Stolen Legacy Bibliography, WLVI-TV, 75 Morrissey Boulevard, Boston, 02125. And we are going to be taking your phone calls now. 288-3120 is the number, so if you have a question of my guests, please call 288-3120. Again, that number is 288-3120. Sam, now we're skipping here, but about the African presence in the Americas, what was so significant about that?
Well, first we want to point out that slavery had three components to it. There is, of course, the physical slavery, which is ended. There was the removal of the goodies from Africa, the mineral wealth, and then there was a mental bondage that was imposed upon the African mind. That is a cultural lobotomy of sorts that removed history and removed any value from the personage of the African. And what we're trying to do now is re-heritorize Africans. That is to show that Africans played a major role in the creation of civilization and the furthering of civilization throughout the history of mankind.
Okay. You want to add to that, Asa?
Well, the only thing is that, in the first place, we're indebted very much to Dr. Ivan van Sertima for much of the information that has been synthesized to help us to understand the proof of the fact that ancient Africans actually appeared around 700 or so years before Christ in America. And, of course, we're one of the few people who have the physical remains, in effect, rock Polaroids of the pictures of these Africans that did that. Might also add that LeGrand Clegg in Los Angeles is one of the top scholars who has helped to uncover much of this information about the African influence on the Olmec. But what I want to clarify, just so that any of your viewers are trying to put this together with what they know about Olmec, what we're saying is that Africans influenced Olmec, not that Africans were Olmec.
Okay.
That Africans appear in small numbers, and then after a short period of time, the elements of African culture begin to be disseminated throughout the Olmec and later world, such as pyramid would be a case in point. Pyramids don't appear in America until after the African Olmec contact.
Okay. Well, let's go to the phones and see what kinds of questions our guests have. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
I wanted to ask, we're being told a lot of things that Africans have done before others. I wanted to know how you would answer critics who say the things that you're telling us are wrong, they're not valid.
Good point. Asa, you want to try that?
Well, since we've been talking about lots of things, I would have to know which thing the critic would say would be wrong.
Well, I think what he's trying to say is, thank you very much for your call. What he's trying to say is that, you know, just everything that we're talking about here, I mean, we're talking about rewriting history books.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the history books say one thing, and we're sitting here saying another. So what gives here? Who's to say that what you're saying is right and what the history book says is wrong?
Well, again, most of the things that we're saying here today, for example, if we say that Greek people went to Africa to study, we're simply quoting the record of Greek people. In other words, these are not new items of information that we just simply manufactured. You will see in Plutarch's Lives, for example, in Plutarch's work on that the reference to Pythagoras going to study astronomy and mathematics in Egypt is clear. That comes from the Greek or the Roman side before it ever comes from the Kemetic side. So that, in other words, there are many elements of documentation that we could easily share. The easiest way to deal with anyone who would criticize the information, however, is for the critic to specify the thing about which they have some disagreement, and then allow us to marshal the evidence to support that. But I agree with the caller. I fully expect that some people have to sit back and say, well, how could this be true?
But then we can all say that history is one man's interpretation anyway. Let's go to another call. Good evening. What's your question?
My question is, I would like to know, how do we get society to acknowledge the African origin of modern civilization in today's textbooks?
Ace, well, Sam, why don't you try that, being a school teacher?
That's a good question. As a matter of fact, you see, there is now a crack in the wall of the racism that separates Africans from their true heritage. And there's what I call the translucent history that's now being written. If you take a look now at a modern history book of U.S. history, you will find references to Africans, though not put in any historical context. For instance, you'll see references to Africans being with Columbus, though they won't mention that one of the pilots of one of the ships was an African. They'll say that he had Africans with him. They'll say the same thing about Cortez, and they will not tell you that these Africans were not just along for the ride, but in fact had directions along with them.
Okay. Do we have another call? I think we should go to line 0, all right? Good evening. What's your question?
Yes, I'd like to know if African influence extended onto the Far East.
The African influence in the Far East is what he's saying. Thank you so much for your call.
Okay, I'm really happy that he asked that question. I wish I had better detailed information, but let me make a reference to the fact that that you have a series of migrations coming out of Africa, first to populate the world. In other words, early man starts in Africa, so of necessity, the first people in all these early places were basically African. However, I think he's talking more about the modern period, and it is through the work of people like Runoko Rashidi and Wayne Chandler and others who specialize in the history of the African presence in Asia, who spell out the details to show, for example, that the earliest population in India is the Dravidian population in India, which is a basic African population. Even in China, as Runoko Rashidi points out in his work, The African Presence in Early Asia, at least one of the dynasties, the Shang dynasty, around 2000, if I'm not mistaken, it's around 2000 BC, was an actual black African dynasty. In fact, they were referred to as oily black people. And so there is, throughout Asia, in the Middle East, and there are military people who have gone to places like Vietnam and who have seen some of the people in Vietnam and been shocked to find their dark color, even after years and years of separation from
Well, see, right in for the bibliography, we do have a book on that list that talks about the African influence in Asia. Let's go to another call. Good evening. What's your question?
Hi. I'd like to know if Egyptians were of black African influence, Why aren't they portrayed in most Egyptian art that I've seen with black skin or dark skin?
Oh, thank you. Let me handle that.
Hey, so you want to handle
Okay,
that? Thank you so much for your call.
Yeah, I really want to thank him for that. You have to realize that most Egyptian art that is sent to us, we see out of chronological order. For example, if you go to the British Museum, you will see the museum is set up so that you see mostly Greco-Roman material, but it's side by side, let's say, with an 18th dynasty piece. If you really want to see the black origin of Egypt, you will look first at the mummies, the actual royal mummies. Look at all the royal mummies of the 18th dynasty, for example. Every one we have is not only dark, but black, very black. If you look at the artwork, we showed some of the artwork in the earlier segments. You saw the picture of the Sphinx from the side view, totally black. You saw Pharaoh Senwosret or Usertsen, totally black. In other words, if you do Old Kingdom first, and if you do kings and queens, then do Middle Kingdom, then do 18th dynasty, and then after that come to the Greco-Roman dynasty, which is in the classical period, you will see that it goes from black to the time of the Greco-Romans when you see royal kings like Alexander the Great, who is white.
Sure. Has nothing to do with disease or anything else. Let's go to another call. Good evening. You're on the air.
Yes. Good afternoon. Good evening. I agree with them, and of course, Professor Joseph Jonkanen in New York City agree with them. Do they believe that Freemasonry started in Africa?
Which of you want to tackle that? You want to try that, Sam?
Maybe Asa can finish it off. Yeah.
Thank you for the call.
First off, as I've said, the term itself, Mason, is an African one. The problem that exists is that the mystery system that Freemasonry developed out of had to be suppressed at one point during European history, and the participants had to go underground.
Okay. Asa?
Right. Well, Sam is correct. See, we know that there was first an ancient educational system that is fairly fully described right now, that was located with its center at a place that today is called Luxor. Or Waset was the old name of the city. That's where the temple of Ipet Isut, which is Karnak today, and Luxor are. And this was kind of a headquarters for a giant university system that peaked in the 18th dynasty around between 1500 and 1300 BC. That system was the system that Greek people encountered operating at the time that they became acquainted with Africa. They were very much impressed by that system. And within a short period of time, they entered that system and adopted its tenets and especially its religion, which meant you had to adopt its educational system too. So that for almost 600 years, the dominant religion in Greece and Rome, before and after the time of Christ, 300 years before, 300 years after, the dominant religion was the religion of Isis, which was suppressed when the church was established by Constantine in approximately 325 AD, I think it was, when the Council of Nicaea was called. That meant they had to drive underground the Kemetic worshippers and initiates and education. And then we have, after that period of time, time and time again, a return to the ancient Egyptian wisdom through secret societies. And if you'll notice in the Masonic order, almost all of their symbols come out of ancient Kemet. Now, as to whether or not it started there or not, I don't have enough knowledge to know, but the circumstantial case is so heavy that we would be wrong to consider almost any other alternative.
All right, we're going to stop here and take another break, but we will be taking more of your phone calls in our next segment, so stay with us. We'll be right back. Back to the phones. Hello, you're on the air. What's your question?
Hello, I'm very interested in this subject, and I'd just like to know why were African ideas stolen instead of adopted, and what did the Greeks have to gain by stealing these ideas instead of giving full credit to the African society?
What did they have to gain,
well, some Greeks did give full credit to the African society. It was there were people who later on, for example, when I think of the stolen legacy, I don't think so much of the Greeks per se as I think of people who came along later. For example, Professor Martin Bernal has done a book called Black Athena. It's published by Rutgers Press. It's a brand new book, meticulously documented by the grandson of one of the great Egyptologists. And in that, he locates a particular university, Göttingen University in Germany, approximately the late 1700s, that started a process of changing the story that the Greeks used to tell about where they went to school. So Greeks readily and freely acknowledged that they went to school in Africa. It was later, really in the last couple hundred years or so, that we've had that story changed, and that was changed for reasons that we can only speculate about.
Sure. All right. Sam?
Yeah, let me add just one thing to that. A good for instance in what Ace has just said is the fact that they've even gone as far as to come up with another disease, Egyptiomania. And those were the people who were ancient Greeks who had this fantasy that their ancient ancestors were Egyptian. So this was all created in the 19th and 20th century.
Let's take another call. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes, my question is concerning genetics, and if, in fact, it is possible, as I've heard.
Can you speak up, please? We can hardly hear you.
Okay, yes, my question is concerning genetics, and if, in fact, it's possible for a black man to be original man, and from him, the brown man, red man, yellow man, and white man are descendants.
In 25 words or less. This is getting into another whole era.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your call, sir.
I refer you to National Geographic magazine, November 1985, to Newsweek magazine, January 11th of this year, and through studies of bones and also studies of mitochondrial DNA, the molecular biologists are now telling us that the original man was a black man. And both those publications actually summarize the research in popular form and place that age somewhere around 200,000 BC. And on the cover of Newsweek, they actually pictured a black man and a black woman. And the idea is that there's a single black woman, according to 3 separate groups of molecular biologists who are doing this work. There's a single black woman who is the 10,000th great-grandmother of everybody on the planet. So that while I can't answer for the geneticists, the process by which this would occur, the reporting that they have given us is that these were black people.
All right. Clearly controversial for sure. Good evening. What's your question?
Yes, I'm concerned about Cleopatra, the Queen Cleopatra and African queens. Can you simply talk about their contributions?
All right. Thank you so much for your call. Cleopatra.
I don't really... I have to say, frankly, I don't know about Cleopatra. Cleopatra is one of the Ptolemaic queens. She comes at a time when the Greeks are in there. That's at the end of...
Was she black?
That's it. Well, I'm just saying that's at the end of the 3,000-year period. What we know is that she lived Egyptian. She spoke Egyptian. In other words, all her behavior and actions were Egyptian, which would have meant that she, the best guess you would make would be that she would be black. But if you look at some of the coins that are supposed to have come from the time, then it leaves a question. So I don't want to go further than the evidence will let us go on that. Many black historians claim Cleopatra. I don't see that it's important one way or the other because Egypt had already done everything that it was going to do by the time Cleopatra got around.
All right. Thank you. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes. If blacks are the original founders of mathematics and the first to civilize this country, how can you explain the reason why the white people have the recognition?
Thank you so much for the call. Sam, you want to try that?
Well, we didn't say that they were the first to civilize this country. No, that would be an insult to the people that were found here. We're saying that they influenced the civilizing of this country. Whites have credit because they've taken credit, and it was necessary to do so during slavery. Simply to take a man and take away his freedom and take away his family, his culture, there had to be some reasoning for it. And the reasoning came out of the academic world that blacks were inferior genetically, etc. And that's how it's done. It's simply taken. But if you look now, you'll see that it's being taken back.
Okay. All right. Let's take another question. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes, I have a question concerning the history. Although the history does show that there's been a lot of achievements made
Can
in the
you
past.
speak up, please?
Yes. Even though the history does show that there's a lot of achievements that have been made in the past by blacks, how today can black people, through education, institutional, social mechanisms, realize some of the inherent capabilities that they have?
Sam, you want to tackle that? Thank you so much for your call.
Yeah, this information is empowering. It's very important for us as black people to have self-esteem, and that's exactly what happens once you recognize that slavery was not the beginning.
Sure.
You can then see that slavery will not be the end.
Very important point. Knowledge is power. Good evening. What's your question? You're on the air.
Hello. Is the oppression of the majority of the black population today related to a natural cycle, and whether or not the black race would again have a chance to become part of a civilization similar to the one you're discussing?
Asa, can you handle that? Thank you so much for your call.
It's a part of a culture. It's a part of a cultural cycle. I don't believe that it's God's plan that black people be on the bottom. So that would be a natural cycle. But I do think it's a part of a cultural cycle. The consequences of war, particularly the consequences of colonization, slavery, and segregation, has put us at a disadvantage. Now, the question as to what the future holds, I have no doubt whatsoever that as we become more conscious of not only who we were, but who we are, and what our innate potential is to compete, to be peers in the world, that we will see the kind of changes that we hope for in a very short period of time.
Indeed. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes, I would like to know if, in fact, it was Carthage and not Greece that was the father of democracy.
Thank you for that call.
Thank you.
Sam?
Well, that's not one that I can answer clearly.
Well, I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure that how was Greece the father of democracy when Greece had slavery? You know, it was democratic in a way, in terms of, I guess, the city-state organization. But I don't know enough about Carthaginian written records to see that in Carthage that you have the antecedents of Greek. It could be that you would have that in Carthage. I was also trying to come down with a definition of the political system of Kemet, which is older than Carthage. You know, Carthage doesn't come online until the first millennium BC, whereas Kemet had 2,000 years even before that, and if it had a democracy, you know, which is, in fact, it did, because the king stood as the representative, but the priesthood was in the same way that Greece was democratic, that Kemetic priesthood had democracy among themselves. So it would be a little hard to say. I guess we'd have to say, I'll have to give you an I don't know on that.
Okay. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes. My question is, can your host briefly discuss the chronology of the displacement of the Kemet culture and who was specifically involved in that displacement?
Thank you so much for that call.
Okay, you have approximately 30 dynasties, which means 30 families that ruled Kemet starting in 3100 BC. In the first 1,000 years, you have two kingdoms within those first 12 families. You have 12 families in the first 1,000 years, and you have the Pyramid Kingdom, and then you have kind of a classical kingdom called the Middle Kingdom. There's an Old and Middle Kingdom. And that means that the Kemites had it all by themselves for 1,000 years before you get an invasion from Asia of a group of people called Hyksos. The Hyksos stay in power from around 1750 BC to maybe 100, 150 years, and they left almost nothing behind. And then you get this grand golden age of the 18th family or dynasty, which is called 18th and 19th family dynasty, called the New Kingdom. And after that kingdom, you have a breakdown, and then you get a return to classical Kemetic civilization in the 25th dynasty around 750 BC. Notice that all the four kingdoms are southern-led native kingdoms. And then after that, it's after the 25th dynasty, as Dr. John Clark at Hunter College in New York is fond of saying, that was Kemet's last walk in the sun politically. You know, that was the last time that the native people of Kemet controlled their own political structure.
Okay. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Hello, my question was in regards to the pyramids, which is, in my mind, the greatest Egyptian architectural feat. How do your people feel there about that the pyramids were actually copied from the Sumerian ziggurats?
Thank you so much for the question. Sam, you want to tackle that?
Well, they're older. They're older, and what do we have left of the ziggurats? They're just shapeless clay mounds at this point. In fact, the ziggurats have to be reconstructed by artists' conception. So, if anything, one would want to look the other way and see that...
Where are these, the ziggurats?
It's talking about
Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia.
You see, Mesopotamia is given credit as the cradle of civilization to direct you away from the middle of Africa, which is really the cradle of civilization.
I see. All right, Asa?
Right. If you look at the date for the pyramid, again, I think Sam's point is very well taken. The stones that we're talking about are still standing. The first pyramid, which is a ziggurat, which is the step pyramid, not the true pyramid, was the model upon which other kinds of pyramids developed. Now, the issue is really the dating of Sumer, Elam, and Babylon, and so forth. And we know that Babylon really never appears until approximately 2000 to 2100 BC, about 1,000 years after Kemet starts. The argument is about when was Elam and Sumer, and not only that, what was the nature of Elam and Sumer, which preceded Babylon, whether these were really anything more than city-states or whether they were nations in the sense that Egypt was. But clearly, if that kind of technology had developed to the level that it had developed in Kemet, then we would expect to have seen a great deal more remaining from it, and maybe someone would have an explanation for it. Much of the dating, however, seems to me to be pure guesswork.
All right. Good evening. What is your question? You're on the air.
Yes, ma'am. This is...
Can you speak up, please?
Yes, ma'am. This is from the book They Came Before Columbus. I would like to know the presence of a white god that they speak about that came before the Aztec and the Mayan people. Was that person, in fact, an African?
Thank you for that call. Who wants to tackle that? Sam?
I'll tell you briefly about the kingdom of Mali, which existed in the 14th century, and there was a king there, Abu Bakr II. And in 1311, he took sail off of the west coast of Africa, and he did actually reach the New World. And that's the God that he's referring to.
Well, again, he's referring to the fact that the Indians said something about a white god. Now, I can't answer it, but I remember, I can't give him the technical answer to the question, but I do remember a discussion about whether they meant white in the sense of race or whether they meant white in some other sense. And so I think that it would be important to go back to Van Sertima and ask him the answer to that question, but I'm not sure that it necessarily means that they meant a white person.
Okay.
And if one considers Abu Bakr in white robe appearing, he might be considered white.
All right, let's take one last call here. Good evening. What's your question?
Yes, I had the question of, I'm reading the book now, it's the architectural history, supposedly. Werner Keller is the author. And he states that from 1730 to 1580 BC, it had been taken. Egypt had been taken. And those are the people that brought in the chariots and the technology and everything. I'd just like to find out about it, if they've improved it since the book was written, or...
Okay, thank you for that call.
Okay. His date is correct, and he's referring to the invasion from Asia of the Hyksos, and he is correct about the chariot and horse. However, in terms of it becoming a major part of Egyptian culture, it does become a major part of Egyptian culture. But to say that the technology appears at the time that the chariot and the horse appear is totally false. Because how would you explain the pyramids, which appear 1,000 years before the horse and the chariot come in from Asia? And clearly any knowledge at all, even basic knowledge of what went into building a 2,200,000 stone 43-story building, each stone weighing 2 tons up to 40 tons. And that's, I mean, if you're talking technology, engineering, astronomy, political science, economics, and so forth, it would be hard to say that when someone came in with these chariots and left nothing but the chariot and the horse, that they would be credited with bringing technology.
I have to cut you off because we've just run out of time, but obviously people are interested in what is happening, and we will see what happens as time goes on about that. But thank you so much, Asa.
Thank you.
And Sam, for being part of this, at least whetting people's appetites. What's been said here tonight was not to prove the superiority of Africans, but rather to show that there has been a centuries-old, very successful and systematic approach to deny an entire race of people a proud and rich heritage. Perhaps the information presented here will stimulate more interest and understanding not only in the legacy left by the ancient Africans, but that of other people of color in the diaspora as well.
These represent the creative genius of African people at the beginning of time, okay? This is a great statement to the world of human possibility. These are monuments to our history, and it shows, as Garvey said, what humans have done, humans can do.
Ramses II was extraordinary because his rule was one of the longest in the history of the world, and his building projects have lasted for eternity. These monuments are important because they're looking south into Nubia, from whence the culture came, the source, the roots of Kemetic civilization. And it's very important for us to appreciate that this is sacred ground.
Ramses II was the greatest of all the kings that bore that name because he consolidated the gains of the 17th and the 18th dynasty. And in the conflict with the South, what is now Sudan, it was settled with a political marriage between Ramses II and the Nubian woman Nefertari. And this political settlement marriage became a great love affair. It was not a great love affair. And her temple reflects the respect that not only he had for her, but carrying out the agreement to treat her with great equality. Now, where we are geographically is close to the Sudan. And now, after Ramesses, this is the 19th dynasty, the great pharaohs of the Lower Nile had their day in the sun. Egypt's great light began to wane. The power in Africa reverted to her parents, Egypt's parents, the Ethiopians. Then they brought into being a great queen known sometime as Belkis, known as Makeda, but better known as the Queen of Sheba.
These temples were built 13 centuries before Christ was born, out of sandstone along what was once the original embankment of the Nile River. But in 1963, 5 nations assigned their best engineers to move these temples to higher ground, to avoid them being engulfed by the rising waters from the newly constructed Aswan Dam. The monuments could not be moved intact, so they were painstakingly cut into smaller blocks and reassembled at this present location. The rescue effort cost a then estimated $36 million and was hailed as an engineering miracle, and rightly so. But what then does one say of those who originally created all of this, some 3,287 years ago? After the trip to Abu Simbel, Dr. Ben delivered evening lectures at 2 of the 3 hotels where the group members were staying.
First, when you went to Abu Simbel, you saw this Colossus temple, 2 of them, that were chopped out, hewn out of a mountain. I wish you had the opportunity to see them before 1961, when they were cut up into pieces because of the new dam, and it will give you an opportunity to see it in the 2 manner, not just as it stands today, even though as impressive as it is. But the first thing is that we have been taught that the only time a man, a ruler, ever built a major temple for his wife was the Taj Mahal. But no one told us that this was here for thousands of years before there was a Taj Mahal, and that an African man had built it for an African woman. An African man from Nubia by the name of Ramses II, the son of Sataiwan, built this temple for the most beautiful queen, Nefertari. The word Nefertari means most beautiful, and the word Nefertiti means the beautiful. Now, Ramses ruled from 1298 to about 1232, before the Common Era. He built this temple as a gift to his young wife because there was some altercation between him and her father to the south in Nubia. But you must remember, Nubia at various times extended all the way north to a place called Ashuit. It is north of Luxor. What you see today as Nubia is an infinitesimal part of what it originally was. So that temple down there represents the reunification of ties, of bonds between ancient Nubia and ancient Egypt. When you look at the first temple, the temple of Nefertari, you notice that the main deity there is the goddess Het-Heru, Hathor. And you notice that Hathor, when shown as a woman, has the ears of a cow. When you get to the Valley of the Kings and Deir el-Bari, you're going to see the whole cow representing Hathor. What else you would notice as you went there, at all four sides of each column, you saw Goddess Hathor. Next thing you should have observed is the manner in which this temple has been reconstructed. And I wouldn't go into the modern aspect of the temple. But you notice that in these temples, what is being told is the life of the pharaoh or life of the queen. The temples of worship, the main purpose is to celebrate the god or the deity of the temple, as well as to tell the life of the individual. When you move over to the temple of Ramses II himself, you notice the four major figures in the front. They're each about 30 foot tall in the sitting position. But in the middle of the four, two on each side of the doorway, above you see the statue of the figure of God Horakti. H-O-R-A-K-H-T-Y. Ra Horakti. Horus in the form of Ra. And above that, there are some monkeys, the baboons, the sacred monkeys, the sacred baboons, each representing a time or the day. And these baboons, being the sacred baboons, you notice 13 of them, symbolic of the extra day and year which they used to have in the ancient calendar of Egypt. It was 13 months to the year, 12 months of 30 days, and 1 month of 5 days. But when you start to go into the temple, on each side of the temple tells us something specific about the kind of teaching that we receive. That is, in the entrance to the temple, where you have the buttress, you notice on one side, the captives, the people who are captured and chained, on one side they have long features. On the upper side, they have a feather in the hair. The funny thing is, in your school book, the ones on the right side as you're going in is called Semitic captives of war, belonging to Ramses II. On the opposite side, the only thing has changed is the features. They look more like you. But the textbook says, captured slaves of Pharaoh Ramesses. But then if you don't look at the features of Ramesses himself, and the one they call the captured slaves, and ask what's the difference and why one is a slave under the same condition as the other one who is a captured what? Enemy, a captured. All right. You have to do some thinking from then on. When Ramesses died in 1232, Jesus is supposed to have been 1232 years after the death of Ramesses. We could go along there and we notice around the wall the many wars of Ramesses, recording of even the Battle of Kadesh. Ramesses recorded every altercation he was in. Why then, when his army is to be drowned by the Red Sea, the water parts away, leaving a tremendous gorge, that his soldiers, men prepared for war, all drowned by this gorge, but the Hebrew children, men and women from age whatever to age whatever, pregnant women, old people, crippled people, all of the Hebrews went down the gorge, down the side, walked up the side of a wall, and crossed over, and not a single one got killed. I just finished reading a paper from the Washington Post in April, showing what this noted world scholar, now they start to question and said, there was no such thing as the Exodus. It was in fact just a folklore.
40 years ago, Philip Fritz began a tradition.
From history for all the way back there. We living in 1987. Well, what do you need a money for? You living now? Get rid of it, you dumb born. No. You see, you gotta put the thing, that's what I've been telling you. You can't just ring it. You got to, you know what they say, and analyze it with what you're doing and what your belief system is, and know how you got robbed. That's why you're here. I didn't bring you here just to give you a long airline trip. You know, and diarrhea. Oh, no, you know the Bible. You know every T and every dot is correct. But you don't know where you stand in it, because when you see the pictures, if I had to go to heaven based upon those pictures, I'd be scared like hell, because I could say, there ain't nothing but crack up here. I won't want to go on those pictures. But when you understand that is a black woman that the Bible is speaking about, that Abraham is going to deny worshiping Goddess Hathor, yourself, then you realize that here too is an attempt to put down the African woman. But we're glad he didn't worship the old. He gave up the cow, and then they go worship Jehovah. He gave up you, the black woman. But you don't know. I don't blame you. Don't know. You just come here and you go see it. As a matter of fact, go down and see it. You're going to see right down, right across it, a picture of Goddess Hathor. Right there. And now, we're going to see not only that, but on the wall, we're going to see at that temple the story of Hatshepsut going to the land of Pu-Anit, which the Jews are going to later, in their Nancy story, call Punt. It will be the story of when the world went to an end, because a fellow named Noah is going to take his little family, put them in a boat, 90 cubits. A cubit is 3 feet, 90 times 3. If my math isn't bad, 3 times 0 is 0, 3 times 9 is 27. 270 feet long. Do you know, this is about 100 feet, 270 feet, twice this building plus 3/4. Now let's say how big that boat is. And they're going to put 2 of everything.
The sense of being a part of something of historic importance was building. By now, the excitement level was high in Aswan. We all had a sense of being a part of something of historic importance taking place in a setting of great historic importance. The emotional content of it all was perhaps best embodied in what this young man revealed to me.
What's your name?
Omar Nobles.
Omar. How old are you?
17.
17. Where are you in school?
I just graduated from McClimbers High School in Oakland, California.
Oh, really? What are you doing out here?
This was a graduation present for my parents.
A graduation? That's kind of unusual, isn't it?
Well, no, my parents believe in to pass on the legacy to the family, I guess. So basically, they came back to Kemet about maybe 10 years ago and felt that this was something that they had to pass on to me and to my 3 sisters. So basically, as each of us graduate, we will be given a portfolio with a message from my parents.
A portfolio? Is this it here?
Yes. It's a diary for me to journalize.
Uh-huh. What was your reaction when your father gave you this ticket?
I was shocked and nervous and worried, and I mean, all these emotions hit me at one time. It was kind of stunning.
Apprehensive too? Were you somewhat resistant?
No, I've seen pictures and slides and heard about Dr. Ben and his works in ancient Egyptian studies. So basically, that part excited me because I was kind of curious in meeting this man for myself.
There's a saying that youngsters know it all. Figure they got it all figured out. This thing called life. Were you part of that cadre?
In some ways. In terms of, parental advice, in terms of hourly going out and, oh, Mom, I should be home by such and such. Well, that's kind of late. Oh, Mom, I can handle myself in the streets. I'm not worried about these people, but you always have to be a little bit comprehensive anyway.
Your father wrote something on the end page here, the inside of the cover. Did you read that?
It says, Dear Omar, your mother and I thought that this trip to Kemet would be the best graduation present we could give you. We wanted to give you the gift of visiting in person, seeing with your own eyes, and knowing for yourself the greatness that belongs to you and our people. The significance of your graduation is that it marks the time that you personally start to make your own mark in history. There is nothing that you can't do or become as long as you believe in yourself, your family, your race, and your God. Look at what we, black people, did. Know what we can do and decide what you will become. You belong to greatness. African blessings and love. Your parents, Wade and Vera Nobles, Ptah Hotep, 6/29/87.
What does that mean to you?
That my parents are probably the best parents ever in the world. My father's, I don't know, it's like he sees all these things ahead of me that I really didn't pay much attention to. And he knows more about my greatness than I did for myself. And after being in the black land, I was starting to see for myself that it's about time I get on the road and do for myself.
Do you think there are any limits to what you can do or be?
After seeing the pyramids and Ramses II, there is no limit to anything.
Ahead of us was the ASCAC conference, where some of the leading American historians of African descent would lecture. And there were those awesome temples and monuments waiting to reveal to us their ancient bond with each of us, as you will see in the next hour in our 3-part series called Return to the Nile Valley.
I've kept my mouth shut long enough.
They are now gathering to witness a conference in Aswan held by an organization of historians of African descent called ASCAC, which stands for the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. In this hour, you'll see what developed in that conference and also see more of the continuing tour of monuments and temples after the conference. All that after this.
Egypt is a country of about 45 or more million people. Those people live in about 4 to 5% of all the land. The Nile, along the Nile, that's the fertile land. Egyptian education is free, completely free. Education is free to and including college. You don't study what you want. You study what you prove you're competent of doing according to your record. Egypt is a partly socialist, capitalist, mixed economy. You can't starve in Egypt, it's impossible. Every man, woman, and child in Egypt is guaranteed bread, coffee or tea, and sugar. You may not be living good, but you can't starve. All housing is controlled by rental. You cannot raise the rent without approval of the government, even the houses for the rich. Housing is hard. You could see it everywhere to get because of the population increase. There are thousands of young people waiting to be married, and because of housing, they have to wait. Let me explain something. People don't mess with their virgin daughters. They are virgins at the thousand living in a mother and father home, 45, 50, 60, 70 years old. It is the common way of life here. A woman 40 years, let's say, unmarried, virgin, has a job, maybe supporting the family, cannot go out without her mother's permission. She comes home from her work. If she wants to go down the street, she has to ask her mother. She can't go and open her own private apartment and live there and a boyfriend visiting. No. When she gets her first marriage, she is expected to be a virgin and must submit the proof to her mother that night. She gets a little piece of cloth to put under her, and she must show the blood stain by morning. About 99.9% of all first marriages for women in Egypt are virgins. You violate the rule and you are a trap. So it's serious business, gentlemen. Please take precaution in terms of addressing women. You will see women wearing black. Primarily, they are women from the country or used to be living in the country and moved to the city. It shows that they are married or they are widowed. Mostly if they're wearing black lace that you could see through to the design underneath, they are engaged. If they're not wearing black of any sort, unless they're Christians or so forth and have a ring, they are single. That doesn't give you the right to approach them. You approach an Egyptian girl or a Nubian girl by asking a friend to introduce you to her parents. Men don't ask her or approach her directly. Now you're talking about Cairo, it's a different thing. Cairo people do anything. Like in New York, Sin City. I thought that you needed to know that because you're going to be moving around.
And the ASCAC conference was held in Aswan in the Nubian Conference Center, a facility donated to ASCAC by the people of this city. All 800 members of the touring group attended to hear a series of lectures by some of the preeminent African scholars of African history. all of whom have formed this organization.
Once I started studying that language and realized it was more than just simply grammar that I had to get, the whole spirit of the civilization out of that language, and started doing that, then I just went through a series of transformations. Now, then I understood the dream that Ben had. That is the dream that we had to really make this Nile Valley flourish again. Then I understood the dream that going back to the 19th century, Martin Delaney had about the ancient Nile Valley civilization and so forth and so on. And so I started dreaming that dream, you know, on my own in a certain way, and saying that, you know, it would be great if we could really pull an association of all of the African scholars and all of the African people who can be led to believe this way into an association, cutting across disciplines and so forth and so on, and really move in that direction.
Professors John Henry Clark and Joseph Ben-Jekinen are elders in ASCAC.
Brothers and sisters, we have come to this sacred place, this sacred land, made sacred by the history that unfolds here with the help of our ancestors. We must remember that here on the Nile Valley, in both the upper and the lower part of this valley, we produced a great civilization that was a composite civilization, a civilization that was a mixture of many African civilizations and not just the civilization of the Lower Nile alone. We produced that civilization in full before the first invader, before the first European wore a shoe, lived in a house that had a window. And foreigners gave nothing to it but to bring it down. While this was the first and the best known of the great river civilizations of Africa, it was not the only river civilization of Africa. It is the best known. It is the best known because it inherited the best talent in the African world as technicians and as builders. We must remember that we are not here for a vacation. We are here to reaffirm a sacred commitment, not only to reclaim Africa physically, but to reclaim it culturally, because if you don't reclaim it culturally and politically, you have not reclaimed it at all. With this said, I am pleased to announce that this 4th annual conference of the Society for the Study of Classical African Civilization is over.
The conferees heard a series of lectures about various aspects of African history and culture, as well as its implications. These presentations were made during a 3-day period.
It's been about 10 years since I first met Dr. John Henry Clark and Dr. Ben-Jekinen at a time which I gave my first lecture on melanin in a large public setting at the State of the Race Conference held in Los Angeles in 1977. So 10 years is indeed a circle of time to have passed, and I too would ask the great brother if I have permission to speak. important to appreciate the role of the elders. They bring to us so much from the world that is hidden or beyond comprehension. And it is an honor to have them to guide us, and we always seek that kind of direction. My topic today will address the subject of the Kemetic maps of consciousness and looking at the question of a mentor in the Book of the Gates. Let me kind of begin with an overview and say that in some books, they begin with an opening saying that in the beginning there was darkness, or if you will, blackness, and from that came light. That does not mean that dark is dirty. That does not mean that dark is chaos, meaning of disarray and anarchy. Rather, it raises the question that was presented to Dr. Benjamin yesterday, that darkness is the womb of life. It is a doorway through which things come from which are beyond material comprehension. And then it takes on a material presence that is more, quote, gross or coarse in manner, if you will, solid, liquid, and gaseous. But that blackness is indeed the birthplace through which light passes and it takes on material presence. We now see, and our records tell us, that our African people, especially Kemetic civilization, said that in the South, there were two great lakes. One lake from which would come the Blue Nile, and from another series of lakes which would come the White Nile. And these two great lakes of Tanana, which are described in the book of Coming Forth by Day, are indeed the Holy Land. It is from this holy place that the Africans, or what we call the human forms, took on presence. It is from this place that a people who then later developed the left pillar, right pillar, cortical hemispheres, we call the Twa people, or the Anu people, who would develop an earlier group, and then in excess of 1 million years ago, move out and populate the entire planet over 1 million years ago. All of them being Africans.
We are African Americans. Now, some people have real arguments with that. I don't want to get into the argument. I understand the claims, both sides of it, so that's cool. But for the sake of argument, let's just suggest that we are African Americans. And you don't believe that you got a lot of American in you, check you out as opposed to your brothers and sisters over here. Check out the kind of disrespect we show to each other over here. Check out the kind of imitations of Europeans that we do inadvertently. Look at the kind of reliance on certain kinds of lifestyles and certain expectations that have come about by virtue of our enslavement. Let's understand that 400 years of that experience have made us Americans. Not Euro-Americans, but African Americans. We are still Africans, but we have a tribal experience that must be taken into account, because it is the slave and the American reality that's causing us all our problems. If we were just Americans or just Africans, we wouldn't have any problems. If we were only African people, then there wouldn't be the ability to appreciate African fellowship. If we were only Africans without a very thick disease of Americanism and American experience running through our lives and experiences, we wouldn't be involved in the destruction of each other as males and females and walking away from our children.
Come to the Nile, to the black land, kiss the soil of the ancestors where they kept homage to those who know the secrets of ancient Kemet, those who know to rise. We invite you in Askak to rise to your heights, the highestness of your resurrection. It's not something that will just start now, but it's a progression. It's a journey. The journey means the boats that you see in the artwork that continues to move and to travel.
Homer used to say that Kemet was the origin of Western civilization, which was simply the Greco-Roman civilization at that time. In other words, we can appeal to the Greeks themselves, who tell us in their own words and in their own writing that they borrowed extensively
everything that was of value in Greco-Roman culture from Africa. So we didn't have to wait till George G.M. James wrote Stolen Legacy. The Greeks said that they had taken that legacy in the first place. Plato argued that there was a genetic relationship between Greece and Kemet in the heroic age, during the age of the Greek and the Greek heroes, and even before the age of the Roman heroes, and modeled much of his own work in the Republic and in other writings after the institutions of Kemet. So, for example, the guardians in the Republic bear a remarkable resemblance to the Kemetic priests. The academy that Plato talks about looks exactly like the temple schools in the Kemetic Valley.
At the end of the second day of the conference, the audience was treated to a performance called Queens of the Nile Now, which you'll see in just a moment.
What became of the black people of Sumer? The traveler asked the old man. For ancient records show that the people of Sumer were black. What happened to them? Ah, the old man sighed. They lost their history, so they died. Come, join me in summoning our ancestors by repeating the chant with me. Come, Africa. Come, Africa. Come, Africa. Come, Africa. Come, Africa. The writer and the designer of these magnificent costumes, my queen and wife, Miss Ingrid Thomas Anderson. Please do our hand. Queen of the North.
Thank you very much. It has certainly been our pleasure and honor to bring Queens of the Nile here to the Nile to present to the ASCAC members. All of these sisters that you see today, this is the first time they've ever performed it. Most of them. They are queens from your region, and I think they did a wonderful job in 2 days. I said 2 days, is that all they did for 2 days?
Amidst all the cultural and intellectual excitement of the conference, a rift clearly emerged between some members of the organizations. 2 of the elders, Professors Clark and Ben, were plainly at odds with at least one of the high-ranking officers, namely Dr. Maulana Karenga. Dr. Karenga is a professor at the University of California and was once known as Ron Karenga back in the 1960s.
What it says to us is that we are the fathers and mothers of human civilization, that we introduced the basic discipline of human knowledge, and we who are the fathers and mothers of human civilization have no business playing the cultured children of the world. What this does is offer a paradigm or a model of African possibility. As Garvey said, what humans have done, humans can do. So by watching this, by seeing this, by examining this, we have a model of human, i.e. African possibility.
Dr. Karenga, in your educational experience, was any of this run down to you?
No, this was never run down to me. And when I studied it in European civilization, they saw Egypt as part of Europe. Egypt is the only country in the world that ever had to justify its geography. All the other countries, if you find them a place, people assume that the place you find them in, that's where the people belong. But here in Africa, Egypt is supposed to be part of the Mediterranean or Asia, so So when they taught it as European history or Asian history. We had to break with this tradition and begin to redefine our reality and our own image and interest.
Did the discovery of the truth make you angry?
Of course it did. It made me angry that the European would lie so systematically, that he was such a small human. He needed to hoard all history. He understood that history and humanity are dialectically linked, that the more history, the greater grasp you have of your history, the greater grasp you have of your humanity. And what he wanted to do was to dehumanize us. So one way to do that, a sure way to do that, was to take away our history and make us, as Malcolm said, a non-historical being, i.e. a Negro.
Are you saying then that it's a tool of oppressing a people?
Oh, yes. The destruction of a people's history is one of the first acts against the people. To interrupt a person's history, as Cabral, the African revolutionary theorist, said, to interrupt a people's history, to appropriate it, is to at the same time appropriate their capacity for creating progress and contributing to the forward flow of overall human history. So what one does is loses one's identity of purpose and direction here, because all acts are historical acts. All acts toward establishing identity, purpose, and direction are historical acts. And one does not grasp one's history, one has a question about one's humanity. Therefore, when the black people could identify with nothing but Mississippi, Alabama, or Georgia, they assumed, like Topsy, they just sprang up. And they were glad to be anywhere other than the home of humanity and human civilization, i.e. Africa.
You have been studying the history of the Nile for some time, but I understand this is your first trip here. Is there any specific impact that eyeballing it is having on you?
Oh, it certainly is. I mean, in the final analysis, practice proves everything. And just to come back is a kind of spiritual experience, especially to come back with ASCAC that Jake and I had first founded along with other co-founders, to put together a project like this, to bring back home 1,000 people is a spiritual experience in itself. And to see all these people interested in rescuing and reconstructing our classical African civilization is an upliftment for me. And it certainly will deepen my appreciation for the project ASCAC, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, is involved in.
At the conference, Dr. Karenga argued for a particular interpretation of ancient Egyptian culture and religion. But Dr. Ben differed strongly.
He wrote the Hosea, a book he called the Hosea, which he took from various ancient books, holy books, sacred books of the Nile. He rearrange and interpret as he see fit the sayings from these different books. He wanted me to endorse it. I let him know I can't endorse it if it was a book that you say to inform people, I could endorse it. But when you want this to be the canon book, the book.
What does that mean, like the Bible?
The Bible, the sacred book of the organization. And I felt that ASCAC should have no sacred book. People should be allowed to be Christians, Muslim, Buddhists, anything they want. But we should get information to them, to let them know what all these things are, about, where they came from and the source. That created a hard feelings between the brother because I refused to endorse the book. And the brother then started to insist that it be adopted as by ASCAP as the divine work. And I, who took an oath in respect to the mysteries of here, those works, and studied here, it is impossible for me to consider a work that is nothing but extracts from the original with an interpretation by a man who considered that he got a divine a word from a goddess Ma'at, the goddess of, to do this and to make a work better than the things he copied. And change around, I couldn't do that. Not in good conscience. And that's the alleged point of hostility. It's not a point of hostility. I don't differ with the brother in many other things. That is a particular thing, and I would differ with him if he was Jesus Christ or Muhammad or God or Jesus or Moses on that point.
Beyond the argument over interpretation of African history on the Nile was the issue of respect.
In my case, I didn't even mind about the respect, because I said, respect aren't demanded, respect is earned. The vast majority of you, as you see yourself, the people show me that respect. It is, you see where it is, Gil? Since I'm not hung up on this doctor business, since I write in a vein for the masses, since I've been fighting that we not be addressed as doctor this and doctor that we address as brother and sister, so that all of us would have the same status, all of us would have the same camaraderie, and nobody will feel that because he's Dr. So-and-so, he have more input. They can't see that. Some of them feel, well, I work for this and I'm a scholar and all this kind of thing. You see, that had never been anything to me, because my father reminded me that most of the people that give out doctorate didn't have any. They didn't even have a degree. Degree started by a man who didn't have one.
He has a right to be resentful of people who come into the field and establish themselves as authority, who wasn't even born when he entered the field. That anger is justifiable.
Some in ASCAC saw it simply as the normal friction involved in the changing of the guard.
It is difficult to turn loose sometimes that stage that represented your flowering, and so that's the way I interpret what happened the other night.
Just that he does not like stepping down.
That's right. He wants to remain active, and I think he's just afraid that when he goes to this next step, there won't be anything for him to do. But I have always tried to assure him that my concept of eldership is that at that point, you are at your most valuable position for the community.
There's a certain degree of paternalism that develops over a field of knowledge that you have been the sole pioneer in for a very long time, and a sense that other ways and other people and other perspectives of doing that thing is suspect. I think that's a part of the stridence that comes along with age and pioneering and long-term commitment to that. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that there's a certain arrogance that goes along with youth and an unwillingness to give proper respect to those who came with limitations, but sincerity nonetheless. And the inability to reconcile those forces, that is the stridency of age and pioneering spirit and the paternalism that goes along with that, with the kind of eager enthusiasm of the young scholar who is coming along doing that. And I think that the pain and the conflict that seemed to have been reflected in that presentation has to do with the conflict of those energies which are confronting each other. My sense is that that's an inevitable process. I think that happens within a family with parents versus their adolescent youth who are beginning to come into their own adulthood, and the need to do certain things that are rebellious often in doing that in terms of negating the power, the responsibility of the parents. I think there's some of that that's inevitable. And I think one of the things that I tried to identify in the presentation I gave last night is that conflict is not always bad. Pain is not always bad. It is in pain and in conflict that new birth often comes about. I think the problem is that when we use the conflict as a means of dismissing the struggle that's inevitable in terms of that whole growth process. And I think if we see it as growth, and I think if we work towards trying to reconcile the differences and to bring about the mutual respect, that is, Dr. Ben needs to have greater respect for the youth. I think that the youth need to have greater respect for the contribution that Dr. Ben made, given his time, given his situation.
The rift was apparently a serious one, and most who attended the ASCAC conference couldn't help but see it. And this caused a lot of confusion, because most of those who had come came because of their interest in Dr. Ben. And they assumed that this group of historians was an extension of Dr. Ben, which in a way is true. So seeing Dr. Ben at odds with his own organization, ASCAC, was disconcerting to say the least.
We have these jerks, these fits, these starts, these conflicts as generations move together, and they're trying to move into their proper niches. We revere a Dr. Clark. We revere a Dr. Ben. And that's what our generation hopes to do. At the Great Lodge at Luxor, we hope to do the appropriate thing for them and to make our commitment with a new covenant to rebuild a new African consciousness among our people wherever we find them. And this is the greatest tribute we can make to them in respecting the work that they have done.
The dissension would carry over beyond this conference back to the United States. But for now, the pilgrimage would continue. There was a great deal to see, as you will see in a moment. From the lectures they had heard at the conference, lectures on site of the monuments, and lectures each evening.
You attended the conference, 3 days. Some of you went to the temple at Philae yesterday, some this morning, and some in the afternoon. About the temple of Philae and what else you saw. When you land there, you probably land at Trajan's Spear. Trajan, the Roman emperor. What's significant about this temple? There are many things, but in particular. Number one, to me, is it the first time you're going to see a temple or part of a temple dedicated to the world's first known multi-genius. I am Hotep, or otherwise Imhotep. You see, in life-size sketch, single-line sketch, beginning the story of the first murder in human history ever recorded. Is going to deal with the murder of Osiris by his brother Set-Typhon. It's going to deal with the first known surrogate mother, goddess Het-Heru or Hathor, who is going to keep Isis's young son, the virgin born Horus, born from a virgin and immaculate mother 4,100 years before Mary did the same thing. Now, you're going to see in this same temple, as you pass that wall, the big wall you see with that shape is called a pylon. That's what it's mean by the pylon. The outer wall with the door is the pylon. You pass through the first pylon, and you get into the second courtyard, but you quickly notice, on your left-hand side, you are seeing two people throwing holy water over the Pharaoh. You are plumb in the presence of a baptism, but you are told that the first time a man baptized another one was when John the Baptist baptized Jesus. You found out that was a lie. Because you're seeing a baptism that took place before the birth of Jesus.
I came to Egypt in '82, convinced I was a very educated American woman. I went home and I completely re-educated myself. I found out that things I had learned in school were lies. They were not true. Omissions were made, impressions were given that did not exist. I'm returning now 5 years later, completely re-educated.
Hi. We've been miseducated in the sense that we have not been told the complete story. We've been told from when we came on slave ships and not before. So this is a great revelation and a great mental adjustment in that our minds are being freed, in a sense, in a real sense, which is necessary.
Well, I've learned that for one year, this is not a European country, and that all they said about Greeks is not true. The Africans really did have something to do with building the temples and the pyramids, and a lot of stuff here that I didn't know back in the U.S. at my school.
African history is totally left out of the educational system in America, in the Western world for that matter. That is why we have to establish independent black schools, such as the one that's in New Brunswick, New Jersey now, the Naira Institute. But it's unfortunate we as Africans do not support our own institutions, and that is a commitment we're going to have to get out of. We're going to have to start supporting our own institutions. We cannot expect other people who destroyed our history, denied us our history. We cannot expect them to also now turn around and support and give us money, finance our institution, and re-educate us. The man that enslaved you is not going to educate you.
You are facing to that separate building on that side. They call it the First House. A custom was started in Egypt 1500 BC, when the first and only lady ruled Egypt as a male pharaoh, Queen Hatshepsut. That was in a glory time of Egypt. She built such a nice monuments along the valley of the Nile. She opened many of the gold mines. The trading expeditions to East Africa was recorded, her famous journey to Punt, and also with all of that, she ruled Egypt for 21 years. The temple was built in the West Bank. They call it Deir el-Bahari, or Queen Hatshepsut Temple, you'll see that. And she proved her right to the throne of Egypt in that way.
When you look at this island, and that everything had to be brought here, we're actually observing one of the great labor systems of the world. What kind of barge brought all of this equipment on this island, all this stone? So they had some intelligence in the use of weights and measures that we don't have today. They also had some intelligence in chiseling and putting things in place that we don't seem to have today. Most of what you see is ashen or masonry, and that is building without cement. There's nothing holding this thing together except the proper placing of the weight on other weights in order to create balance. And the balance was the key to the life, to the society, to the building, to everything that existed in that society. Was a matter of balancing one thing. Most of the pyramids, there's no cement holding all that brick together. But they held together by balance, and they've been there 5,000 years. We can't do that today.
This temple, great temple of Isis, well known in the history, this was the last temple in Egypt. They worshipped to Isis till 396 AD. And after that time, it was converted as a Coptic church and a Coptic monastery. So this was the last Egyptian temple, last temple worshipped. They found on an island facing to the old location a cemetery for the priests. In the 4th century AD, for the Isis temples. Or the same way also, the name converted. May be like the native, the Egyptian name. They call it the Ptolemaics Phila, which means land of friendship, land of brotherly love. So that was, which is the name after that time. So the old name, this was the original island, and whole temples were all half a mile away from here. The elevation of the original island was much lower than this level of this island. In 1902, the British built the old dam on the bed of the first cataract of the Nile. And that was the purpose, to have about 1 million acres planted in the delta of the Nile with cotton and for that, in that time when the old dam being built, this area was converted as a reservoir area. Suddenly, the original island and the temples were flooded. The archaeologists and everybody interested in that monument, they worry that the temples being built with Nubian sandstone, the damaging was started in some places. For this reason, for the fact, with a big appearing from UNESCO, they saved the temples. It was quite an engineering feat. They built a huge cofferdam, 2 big sheets of metals around the original island. The divers, the Navy's divers, they went to the bed of the Nile
They cleared the silt, they took photograph for everything. Then inside the coffer dam, they start to build a great pumping line. They pump water from inside the coffer dam until it's converted at a dry place. In that time, an Italian contractors company was responsible to move the temples, stone by stone, 40,000 blocks of stone. Stone by stone, this project finished in 10th of March, 1980, at the last international cooperation to save the temples. So as you see, it's one of the best preserved temples in all over Egypt, which is relocated.
This was the best recorded period in the history of the world. They wrote on everything. They wrote in the middle of a spoon. They wrote on the handle of a fork. They wrote on everything. Everything had an explanation as to why it came into being. They left it for all the world to see. There should never be any doubt as to who they were and what they did, because they left us a record in signs and symbols and in their writing.
Till 800 years ago was in south of Aswan. That Nubian kingdoms were still the Nubian kings' names, a list known even for the late time. So that was a kind of when the Romans... Here, the stone was left in the same quarry for a long time, and one side is not free, but later on they tried to cut smaller pieces. But even a small part, they discovered the natural fault. So this is the reason why the stone was left here. One side is not free, as you see. And we know that many other obelisks were moved from here.
The tomb of Sarimput II.
Who was he?
He was a noble. At that day, he was called a noble, people of nobility. Would be equivalent to Secretary of State.
The impact of the tombs and monuments had a counterpart in a highly emotional visit to the Nubian village of Dabu. Peopled by a people indistinguishable, save for manner of dress, from ourselves.
me to express my feelings. Very big.
You are happy to see us.
Yes.
It was off to the northern part of the Nile Valley. The 800, including the historians from Azkak, would visit the Grand Temple of Luxor, Valley of the Kings with the tomb of King Tut. Return to the Nile Valley. Now, that might sound confusing, but the fact is that the Nile is the only major river on Earth that flows to the north. So down the Nile is to the north, up the Nile is to the south. We'd all be staying in 3 hotels in the city of Luxor. From here, we would visit the Valley of the Kings, the tomb of King Tut, and a number of magnificent temples, including one that is so huge it staggers the imagination and the naked eye. All of this in this concluding chapter in our 3-part series that we call Return to the Nile Valley.
During the Greek period, what's called a Greek period, the Greek domination, of course the Greek didn't do the work. The indigenous people did the work, but the Greeks were in control. This temple is done during the time of Ptolemy the 12th, the father of Cleopatra the 7th. The Cleopatra that they're always talking about, her father, who changed his name from Ptolemy the 12th and called himself Nous Dionysus, which means the new Osiris. And that's the period of this temple, but it's rebuilt on another existing temple. So you got to be careful. Most of the temples are rebuilt on other temples.
So what we have here is one of the recent temples. It's one of the temples that was built by the Greeks. It really is built on the same location as 2 earlier temples. So this spot is actually a very, very ancient spot for temples, even though what we have here are the ruins of the most recent ones of that process. And what we find throughout Egypt is that very often people will use ancient spots. They always come back to the same spot and build new temples on top of that. And that's what we have here at this location as well.
Dr. Ben, you know what my reaction is when I see this with my own eyes? Anger.
I understand. My brother, I understand.
You know, because I realize that I've been had.
Yeah, you have.
Did you feel the same way when
I came?
Yeah.
I was choked up, frustrated. My anger was like yours, but it had gone to the point where I choked. Because I said, here, everything I've been told come from Judeo-Christianity, I found to have come long before there was anything called Judaism or Christianity. And these are replicas, yeah.
We've done it.
Yeah. And you see the imagery, and they try to deny this. That's what this is the tragedy of slavery. It is not so much the physical pain because they died. It is the mental pain that's left. And I think that the slave masters inherited, the ones who inherit from the masters can never pay.
These are the radiation lines of the sun that come out dealing with the heavens and the ball that's at her womb. She's a goddess that deals with birth, and so it's quite natural to think about the quickening that goes directly from the head area down into the womb. So it's like 2 areas that become so very important, the head itself and then the pelvic region. And we will find that those are the same kinds of glyphs that we do find with the Dogon people when they talk about the balance between earth and sky. And it's a kind of balance between the head region and the pelvic region, saying that we have a kind of a double of every person, one that dwells in the heavens or could dwell in the trees or in the sky or in trees or ground, etc. But anyway, you have a double in nature, and that becomes like your idealized type or your idealized self.
Egyptian guides were also on hand to lecture the large group.
They took our civilization, Greek civilization and Romans. That's real Egyptian. That's Egyptian, really.
Just as Dr. Ben said, as well as John Henrik Clark, these pillars are perfectly and symmetrically aligned, and they have been put together without a single piece of mortar. Dr. Record man, how did they actually do this work?
In some cases like that, they chisel it into the wall, stone itself. They bring the solid stone, a block, and then they cut the block round, and then they chop in. But as you could notice, in this case, they put on the plaster. Let it dry, and not completely. And then they took a pattern and they put it on and they carve out when it's damp.
So this is not solid rock.
There are two types.
Plaster over rock.
This is plaster, but on that, you got two types. Notice there are two types.
He dug into that one.
One dug in, and this is plaster.
You know, I was noticing that up in the ceiling, there are holes.
Oh, yeah. For the hinges, there were cedar doors. Big, solid cedar doors.
Oh,
in two halves.
And this was all colors. Because I see some of the ceilings.
Yeah.
They were all beautiful colors.
My brother, this is called Hippo-style hall.
In each entrance, you could see the snake, and sometimes snake with a crown of Upper Egypt and double crown of Egypt or upper that's with lotus flower behind it. This is in any section. When you go, if you go behind on the entrance of the temple, in the back, just behind the wall, the back door itself, you see that on two sides.
That's the Caduceus.
Yes,
the modern day symbol.
The modern day, yes.
It came from here?
It came from here. Yes.
Right? So you mean the white people were not the ones who invented all this medicine?
No, don't believe that.
Here you have the baptismal or purification of the Pharaoh. The god Tahuti or Tut, the god of the scribes, along with god Horus, baptizing the Pharaoh, Ptolemy 12. The baptism is done with holy water. The water is symbolized by the Ankh and also the Was, W-A-S. The Was is the greatest symbol. Here is a Was. This is a Was. This staff with what appeared to be a goat head. And here is an Ankh. They took the Ankh and the Was, joining them together intermittently, and created the water. And thus you have Ankh was all the way. This is the purification rite, because the Pharaoh cannot be installed, coronated, without being purified. The removal of all his wrongdoing, because since he's going to be the Pharaoh and he's going to represent the people with the admonitions of Ma'at, I have not done any wrong. I have not committed murder. I have not robbed. I have not speaking with an ill tongue, to make sure he has to be purified, like Jesus was purified.
And those are the urns that are pouring out the water?
Pouring out the water, both sides. Then the next scene, after purification, now Ptolemy the 12th is coronated with the crown of the north and the crown of the south, the crown of two lands. We know it is so because here is God happy. Symbolically, of course, the God happy. And look at the good word. We know it is the God of two lands because he represents both men and women. The breast of a woman and the penis of the man, the penis held in the penis container, the penis cup, like a jackstrap. God happy represented with the lotus flower and the papyrus plant. And here you have Isis following below. How we know it's Isis? By the chair at the crown, so that we know that these different gods. And everybody carrying the Ankh. Good life and reunification with ancestors in the new world. The Africans put symbols of animals and birds to represent certain qualities in the deity. A falcon flies fast, high, and is strong, right? God is fast, strong, wise, and reliable. Therefore, the falcon. The lion is strong. The lion will rip you apart, represent the strength of the Pharaoh. So they use a lion. You get what I'm saying? The crane with his long bill symbolizes writing, a quill pen. He is represented, the scribe, because you use quill to write, and they use quill to write. So why not use the crane to represent the god of scribes?
As we move from one site to another by day, Dr. Ben's lectures by night help keep our perspective.
We go to Edfu, the temple of God Horus. There you will notice that there's been a number of temples over a number of years been built there, one on top of the other. You will notice that they even took one temple and used those stones, our old temple of Hatshepsut, that's going back to 1550, before the Christian era, and used it for paving the courtyard. But you will also see where the Greeks copied the colonnade architecture. You will see in there the great green marble statue symbolic of God Horus, represented as a falcon. We're in the crown of the north and the south, the two lands. In there you will see surveying instruments, mathematics for surveying, mathematics and the layout of that temple, showing you the ways the old ancient Egyptian figured things. Measuring tools, a Nile meter. They didn't guess when they go by high tide and low tide. They didn't guess when there would be a flood. They could tell by a meter they had made. In there you will see where the copy, where the idea for the Jews talk about the Ark of the Covenant. You will see where they copied it.
This is a facsimile of the Ark boat. The Ark of the Covenant is a copy of this. The original is taken and carried to the Cairo Museum. And this has space here for the public.
Oh, this is such a revelation, such a profound feeling. We've been told, of course, by Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark and all our elders that we can trace our medical history and healing art back to, of course, our ancestors in Nubia and Kemet. And to come here and see the actual documentation that our ancestors left for us it's a profound and wonderful feeling.
And you ask why I'm mad in the United States every day. I've been mad for 1939. I ain't gonna stay that way until Nubia and the rest of the whole 11.3 million square miles get back in our hands.
Let me mail you.
And St. Patrick, take the Vatican and St. Peter's Basilica and the square, add it together, and you could put it in one corner in the temple I'm talking about. This is the temple at Warit, W-A-R-I-T, now called Karnak. This temple has temples within the temple. This temple has its own lake. This temple is 1.5 miles long by half mile wide. You can't walk the temple and check everything. This temple has hypostyle hall of columns. Columns 50 feet tall. Take 6 of the tallest men here, holding finger to finger, can't stand it. Each column, not a mortar, no mortar, all cut stone. You can't take a sheet of paper and push between the joints. And you tell me we are an oral people. We don't write. What the hell kind of already talking? It's mathematics, it's plans that build this temple. This is the temple that you're going to find most of the obelisks all over the world, especially in Rome where they now put cross on top of them, came from. The one in Central Park called Cleopatra's Needle, got nothing to do with Cleopatra. That's the obelisk of Thutmose IV. It is in here, in this temple, you will see God mimicked in his royalty. In this temple, you will see the obelisk of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. It is in this temple, a few young people in this audience will be in the whole group married. You have come before this gathering stating that you wish to be joined together. In the tradition, we do not join 2 people. It is not the custom anywhere in the continent of Africa to join 2 people. We join 2 families, 2 villages, 2 waters.
Land is spiritual. The human family is spiritual. The birds and bees are part of a spiritual continuity. All of it had to harmonize. So the Africans created the concept of Ma'at, M-A-A-T, that there is a harmonious cosmic force in the universe that everyone seeks to arrive at. And it's a spiritual dimension of life. That's why these great things were built. If you look at the pyramids only in terms of its technical dimension, you miss the enormity of it. If you look at the Temple of Karnak, which was generation after generation building to their God concept, the greatest temple complex in the history world, you miss what the Africans were all about. If you walk the mile-long Sphinx that linked the great temple complex at Karnak with the great lodge at Luxor, the temple at Luxor. That was the great university center of the world, where there were tens of thousands of people learning how you move from a low level of consciousness to the highest level of godliness within your human context. The arts, the healing arts, the scientific arts, the arts of studying the universe, music and whatnot was taught in the Great Lodge. It is the granddaddy and grandmama of the Masonic order, of the Rosicrucians. It is the prototype of the Temple of Solomon. It was built and enlarged 500 years before Solomon. This pillared temple along the Nile was the model that inspired the Greeks to build the Parthenon.
This is the Temple of Karnak. It is in reference, that is in tribute to the god Amun-Ra, a god of Wad, or the breathing thieves. There are many points to the god Amun. One concept has to do with that he represents the emanation of that god force that is hidden. Some would make reference to that as being the statement of the access to the higher levels of awareness and those parts of ourselves that remain hidden, but indeed can be made visible with proper work. And so that is a very, very important concept. Many falsely portray the priesthood of Amun as in later years becoming a very difficult group to work with. But the key thing to be raised, it was from the same place, Wa'at, that African people later did reclaim the entire of their country after an earlier invasion of so-called Hyksos people. And it came from this place that we also have in Wa'at that there was a resurgence. And the African people did emerge from this place and then did retake all of Egypt, and Egypt went on to have a tremendous, Egypt did have a tremendous renaissance, a very vast degree.
are at the temple. It's called the Temple of the Grand Lodge here at Luxor, the Temple of Ammon. And the interesting thing about this particular temple is that it demonstrates in a fairly significant way one of the things that you see consistently throughout all of the temples, and that is that these places, for whatever reasons they happen to be, are actually spiritual centers.
That is the main vestibule?
That's the main vestibule. That's the surface of the front of the temple itself. That's the entrance into the temple.
And then you'd walk through these columns until you get progressively closer to the Holy of Holies.
To the Holy of Holies. And one of the interesting things about this temple, too, is the tremendous length of it. It's a tremendously long temple, and it's probably one of, I guess, next to Karnak, it's probably one of the larger ones, of course, in its original form. And in fact, in years gone by, of course, the two temples, this Luxor and Karnak, were actually connected by the Avenue of the Sphinx. The Karnak temple is about 2.5 miles down the road there, and in the ancient times, the two temples were actually connected by this fantastic Avenue of the Sphinx. So I'm sure that in the days of its glory, it was probably one of the most magnificent structures you could ever imagine. All people would come. All people would come outside and would gather in front of the temple. So there's usually a huge courtyard in front of the temple itself. As you move from the courtyard, there is a kind of a vestibule, an opening into the main part. So some of the special people of the religious people would come into the first opening of the temple. Then eventually, the actually accommodation for people becomes more and more narrow as you move back until you get to the Holy of the Holiest, and no one went there except the priests themselves. The priests who had gone through years of personal preparation, purification, and understanding of where they were and what they were doing, and that was a restricted area. And no one came there unless it was the priests or the pharaohs or the kings themselves in terms of a place of worship and sacrifice and ceremonies which occurred there. So the priests would execute the ceremonies, the people would get messages or indications of it from the outside and would vicariously participate from their presence outside.
So the grassroots knew what was going on inside, even though they couldn't physically be there.
Yes, and very often, for example, when they had the grand ceremonies, I'm sure all the people from thousands of miles around, hundreds of miles around at least, would come and would be outside, particularly along the Avenue of the Sphinx. But they would not be inside where the ceremonies and the main sacrifices and ceremonies were taking place. Those were never seen. Those were seen only by the grand masters of the lodge or the high priest of the temple itself.
When was this temple built, and was it built by the Egyptian, the African, for themselves, or was this under the Greek rule?
Okay, I don't know the exact dates, but this is the temple that was built by the Egyptians themselves. It was built by the Egyptians themselves.
Not at the behest of anybody else.
No. And one of the differences, of course, in this temple and many of the other ones that are much better preserved is the fact that this is one of the original temple structures itself. It goes back to the Egyptian era itself. It has nothing to do with the Greeks, nothing to do with the Romans. This is the model temple itself as it was built by the original African people. It wasn't just a church. You see, it isn't just a church. They were places for learning. They were places for instruction. They were places for study. They were universities. For example, Karnak, which is the temple we cannot see from here, which is the one that's connected with this one. Karnak was the University of Apet-Asset, which was, in fact, one of the largest universities. In fact, I understand at one point there were almost 80,000 students who were studying there at that particular university. 80,000 students.
At one time?
At one time. At one time. And so all of the temples were places of instruction. And see, that's the difference. In a society which integrates the spiritual and the secular, where there is no separation in church and state, where science is not separate from religion, then of course, then there's always an ongoing process. So they didn't just meet here on holy days and have a good time and wave the incense and then all go home and have Sunday dinner. It isn't the whole concept of the churches that we have, but these were places which were centers of learning, they were centers of instruction, they were centers of research. That's the other significant thing. They did research here in the sense that in some of the places we've seen observatories, we've seen hospitals within the temple itself. So there were many, many uses that were made of temples which go far beyond the idea of a church.
Why did such a people with such mastery, with such sensitivity, why would such a culture and a civilization die?
All we can do is really speculate, but it's a speculation, I think, that's really very critical, because I think that what we can learn by whatever led to that are the things that kill civilizations, even in their greatness. And I think there are certain kinds of indicators. One of the things that we can certainly look at is that there was a decline in the society whenever there was an invasion from the outside. That is, the infiltration of other kinds of elements that begin to diffuse the richness and the centrality of the culture itself. That somehow, as long as the culture, and I don't mean a reliance on inbreeding, and I don't mean that outsiders coming in is necessarily destructive. I think that when outside influences begin to destroy the substance and the essence of the culture, then you begin to suffer the consequences of that. And as the Greeks, as the Romans, as the Hyksos, that is, the Asians, Arabs, begin to come in, there were diffusions within the culture. There were resurgences in the Egyptian culture, the Kemetic culture. That is, the culture regained its strength at points when those invaders were able to be thrown out.
I think it's a very dangerous...
Is that, by all fairness, this was our Jerusalem, and it existed over 3,000 years before Jerusalem, and it is still in basically its original form. It was a spiritual city. It was here at Abydos where the mummification process took place, for the weighing of the heart to decide whether the person has lived a life worthy enough for the person to enter paradise, the hereafter. This years before the Christians invented a concept called heaven and hell. More important is that in its structure and in its design, it is still in its original form. All the records, the drone records, carved records of the other pharaohs, Greek pharaohs, all here at Abydos. And another thing, when you look at the building, you look at each column has writing on it. Each wall has writing on it. This was before electricity, before the flashlight. How could anyone see that well? Those fine details that you see. Again, this was the best recorded age in the history of the world. So Abydos is truly the holy city of the African people all over the world.
You walk in the temple, you see this vast complex. You look to the right and you see buildings, ruined buildings with Roman arch, with Gothic arch. How the hell are going to be Roman arch and Gothic arch? There's no Rome yet. There's no Greece yet. Greece doesn't come into existence until 833 when Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Rome doesn't come into existence with the Etruscans, and that is at best 1000 BC. And Ramesses died in 1200 and at BC.
This is considered to be the place where the head of Osiris was buried, or his, if you will, a statement of his consciousness, and that it does indeed relate to a understanding of blackness in its full detail in the different phases of life.
What has been unfolding in your eye is the original story that you heard as Jehovah, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. But it's in its proper name is Ra, taking the place of what Jehovah took. Osiris, taking the place of what this imaginary angel had, and Isis taking the place of what Mary took. But when you finally get to Abydos, you will find that there is actually an angel equally as the angel that's supposed to bring the sperm and place it into Mary. You will see a harp taking the sperm from Osiris and placing it into a set to cause the Immaculate Conception.
En route to the Valley of the Kings, the colossal statues of the pharaoh Amenhotep III and his queen Tai. Awesome in their proportions, made of sandstone. The Valley of the Kings lay just beyond. Perhaps the most sensational tomb in this valley is the tomb of a king who died in his youth. Like It Is did a documentary on him back in 1978.
This is the Valley of the Kings. This valley had already given up a great store of tombs of Egyptian rulers. Archaeologists explored and dug up the length and breadth of this Egyptian valley until November 4th, 1922, when workers uncovered a single step that led downward. So down they dug until they found a door behind which lay the long-sought tomb of Tutankhamun. Behind that door was a room that was filled with artifacts and relics that had been placed there when the young king had been buried. One by one, painstakingly so, these artifacts were brought up the stairs into the sunlight for the first time in over 3,000 years. It would take several months to label and categorize and then pack away each priceless piece, several of which are now here in New York to be seen. It was a sensational find. However, not many of the people were aware that these pieces had been created for a tomb, not to be seen. What kind of artist would create such an exquisite work for no one to see?
King Tut came out of the end of the 18th dynasty. And he is fortunate in that the grave robbers who literally went over Africa, taking everything in sight, did not find his grave. He was a minor king who had a major funeral. Now, he is well known for what they found in his tomb. If they found all this grandeur in the tomb of a teenage minor king, let us think what they could have found had the other tombs been intact. The Africans literally pioneered in elaborate funerals. And African people today, throughout the entire world, still bury elaborately, go in debt to, as we say, put them away nicely. They put them away nicely in ancient Egypt.
We're talking about a man who lived during the 18th dynastic period. A dynasty is a period of rule. It could be a family or it could be one person. We're talking about an individual who, for the most part, did very little within the 2 years that he lived as Pharaoh of Egypt. The word Pharaoh means king or head of state. Why? Tutankhamun took the throne at age 17 and died at age 19. It's bad enough that he would have been a teenager ruling the greatest country in the world at that time, the most powerful. But he was an invalid besides being a teenager. Then you ask, then why was he on the throne? Because it was his time to rule, having been adopted by one of the most noted pharaohs of all Egyptian history. Not only noted from the Egyptian point of view, but noted from even the Judeo-Christian Islamic point of view, because it was Amenhotep, otherwise known as Akhenaten, who gave to the world the concept of the one and only God, otherwise called monotheism. Akhenaten died 43 years before the birth of another African named Moses, which you will find in the book of Exodus.
His mother-in-law was
the beautiful and great Queen Nefertiti, and his grandmother was the great Queen Tai. He came out of one of the most responsible and one of the greatest royal families ever to sit on any throne of any country at any time in the history of the world.
Yeah, this is 18th dynasty. That's important because that is clearly a native dynasty, and as I've indicated in other places, it had its origin with Second Enre, a king who came from the south and started this 18th dynasty, and within that 18th dynasty, the daughter of Tutmosis II was Hatshepsut. This is her mortuary temple. So this temple here is a copy of that temple over there, except it's on a much larger scale. Now let me say something special about Hatshepsut's temple here. Hatshepsut had an expedition that left Kemet and went all the way to Somaliland. And that is pictured, this expedition is pictured over here on the wall of a part of that temple, showing the king of Punt, the queen of Punt, and so forth. But what's more important than that is that Hatshepsut indicated that what she was trying to do here was to build a Kemet in Punt. To build a Punt in Kemet. Now that's a very powerful statement, and she not only made the statement, but she went far enough to do that. That means that she regarded the ancestors of the Kemites to be the people from Somaliland. So she was going back to the ancestral home to pick up relics, to pick up perfume, incense, to pick up plants, and then she actually brought all of those things here to this temple, and her attempt was to reproduce the southern images of Somaliland in Kemet. And so at one point you actually had trees growing in this valley because dirt, plants, and other things had actually been transported and transplanted in the valley here. But I think that is important because it clearly, with the Queen's own indication, links Africans of the center of the continent with Africans of the northern part of the continent.
At last, the brick had
time to sort out the reactions to all that had been seen and experienced, but all agreed that it had been overwhelming, especially because the educational experience for most of us never associated this kind of achievement with Africa.
We have come back from a 400-year bondage, and now we're back home, 9,000 miles home. And it shows the coming forth by day that we're coming home. We're here, and we got to take it back.
Egypt is just something too beautiful for words. I've come home, and I think the conference, one of the beautiful things about the conference is the range of ages, especially the children. I have a nephew who will be 3 this month who's named after the Nile River. His name is Nile, and I would like to think that one day he'll be able to be here and understand the significance of the name that he carries. It's coming home.
How do we get on with the process? Because I truthfully believe that we are part and we're supposed to be here. So what's the next step? What's the organizing process, and how do we get on with it?
I feel comfortable. Feels like it's home. It's a real spiritual thing to see the ruins, to see Ramesses II. Our son's name is Ramesses, and it was great seeing that. I'm going to bring my son here so he can see him.
Other than the heat and Arabs in Cairo, it's great.
The architecture alone was enough to numb the senses. Even more important, we learned that the architecture, awesome as it is, was not the sum and substance of what these monuments, temples, and tombs were about.
Coming out of this sun and this valley that harmonized and reflected the beneficence of God, the Africans created a tribute to God, and that's what all this represents. And it definitely does not reflect the value system of the North or the Europeans or the value system of the Sand people, many of whom come out of the Arab culture, because the Africans balanced things out. The male and female principle were balanced. That's why you see a temple to the male principle, a temple to the female principle together. They put the female at the center of their spiritual value system. Other cultures of the North put the male at the center and they dismiss the female, and the Sand people do the same thing. So these monuments, when you look at the values that they represent, could not have been done by people who come from the northern cradle, because they do not reflect that male dominance. They reflect the harmony between the male principle and the female principle, which is what the Africans have always built their culture around.
In addition to the historians, the group had also been fortunate in being exposed to the many well-respected men and women with expertise in other fields, who gave additional context to the implications of this trip.
When I came, I was hoping for an opportunity to think through the possibilities of an additional channel of motivation for children of color in terms of the educational experience. And coming here has confirmed that even more, that we have to get away from the notion of at-risk and compensation and disadvantaged and all of those negatives, and look for a kind of modality that will open the richness of antiquity to our children, the strength of the power of their people, the beauty of this land, the temples and the tombs. I think that this is a dimension that we haven't looked at, and we must. And I'm not thinking in terms only of children that we call middle class because their parents have the money to finance this kind of a trip, or even a child that we might consider gifted or very bright in the Eurocentric notion of what that is. But I'm talking about the large numbers of our disaffected, disconnected adolescents in the mainstream of our urban cities who can attach themselves to nothing that is positive. I think here is a natural healing for them that we have not considered, and we must. And in that way, I will make efforts to connect with others who have had this experience and to see if it's possible to get our legislators, particularly the Black and Puerto Rican Legislative Caucus, to initiate programs of education with funding that will give us this added dimension for our youngsters.
One of the reasons that I'm here and my whole interest in Egyptology, my interest in African history, is predicated on my presumption that the one thing that immobilizes us and incapacitates us in terms of us being able to use our energies in the kind of self-preservative ways that other people do is this lack of information from youth as well as old, at all ages in our communities.
All right,
so it's a profound impact.
Well, now, I'm kind of slow. You got to break that down for me. Now, how specifically does that work?
Okay.
Knowledge of what went down here centuries ago. How is that going to affect my behavior?
Okay, very simple. One of the things that happens in schools almost from day one is that they begin to tell people who've come from Europe how great they are as a people, how important they are as a people, that they are part of a lineage that came out of the greatness of Rome, the greatness of Greece, the greatness of the Napoleonic era, the greatness of Alexander. Those pictures, those illustrations, those stories, those historical documents, those examinations, those museums, all of those are ways of elevating people's respect for themselves. It says, you are a worthwhile person, and you can do what has been done. And that whole sense of continuity between today, 1987, and 1887, and 1287, and 1087 AD and BC, all of those are ways that people in other cultures have of communicating to their young people and to each other that we are worthwhile and we have energies that can be used. My argument is that we are liking that, and by liking that, we are not able to understand the resources that are available within us by virtue of what we've done as a people. In other words, if you tell people you've never been anything but a slave, you've never been anything but a ghetto dweller, you've never been anything but a failure, you've never been anything but at the bottom rungs of society, then the inevitable result is that that's all I'm capable of doing. And my argument is that if people begin to know that they were kings and rulers and builders of knowledge and builders of world civilization, that in and of itself begins to communicate to young people and older people that if I've done it before, I can do it again.
Now, what about that dissension between Dr. Ben and some members of ASCAC? Well, it has continued and has led to Dr. Ben resigning from the organization. And some feel that this plays right into the hands of outside interests who view ASCAC as a threat and want to see it fail.
Every good organization that African people form, any place in the world, is in danger because the one thing our enemies do not want us to ever understand is the nature of power. And they will send other blacks into the organization to destroy it. And these blacks will be very convincing pretenders of support for the organization, but they will be paid agents of our enemies.
I think that there is a very genuine effort on the part of certain people who understand the significance of this event to undermine it and to sabotage it. I believe that that's very true.
Over and above the internal problems of ASCAC, the monuments along the Nile still stand, patiently waiting for all to come and see the story that they themselves inscribed. But for one important member of this journey, seeing all of this is no longer promised.
Do you think you're going to be coming over here many more times?
Well, depending on the health and strength, and that means whether my eyesight holds up, and my health is holding pretty well. I didn't expect the glaucoma. It came at a critical time in my life. It hit me hard, and I became a little depressed about it because reading has been a way of life for me. I'm self-educated, so you have to understand what that means. I haven't completely reconciled the fact that I cannot even read footnotes without a magnifier. And I cannot recognize the fact that had I known, paid more attention to diet and health, it could have been avoided. But I was rushing, doing so many different things, mostly for other people, that I neglected my own health. And the people that I neglected it for have very little appreciation for the fact that I didn't do this for myself. I did all of it for other people.
I know. And yet, with his eyesight weak, Professor John Henrik Clarke's visionary words at the ASCAC conference perhaps is this journey's best summation.
African people have always been the prize of foreigners and still are. African people have been under siege for more than 3,000 years and still are. Mainly because you have had great riches. Riches in culture, riches in imagination, material riches, and great spiritual riches. You have always had and still have something other people won't, think they can't do without, and don't want to pay for. Every conqueror in Africa first came in as a dinner guest because the Africans are hospitable to strangers. The Africans had not dealt with people who can come into your house, eat your food, rape your wife, and enslave the host. The mentality of the Africans hadn't adjusted to the ice people of Europe and the sand people of Western Asia. And to this day, he hasn't adjusted. The first on our agenda is to get back our sense of being a historical people and stop answering to the word minority. With our total effort in learning history, which means nothing if all you're going to do is recite dates and personalities. You must understand the philosophical meaning, the political meaning, and the cultural meaning of history. And when you look at all these great states, how they were structured and how they were ruled, you need to say to yourself and your children, if I did it once,
I'll do it again.
Very heavy in just a minute. I want you to hold on tight. Here, hold on. They don't have the power to condemn me, so they falsely label me. And they use the stranglehold that they have over the government. Did you hear what I said? The Jewish lobby has a stranglehold on the government. 246 members of the House of Representatives are honorary members of the Israeli Knesset. And 46 United States senators are honorary members of the Knesset. This is why whatever they want, they get it, because the president himself is actually punking out to the Jewish lobby. The president. And let me tell you, selling America right on down the tube. Not only don't they want you to hear what I have to say, they don't want people to hear what I have to say, because, my dear 5% brothers of the 5% nation, in your lessons, who is the 85%? Who is the 10%? And who is the 5%? Look at it. If you notice, no color is used in the number. 85% of the masses of black people have been deceived. 85% of the masses of white people have been deceived. 85% of the human family of the earth has been deceived. And there's a small clique of 10% who know the truth, who know the living God, but are bloodsuckers of the poor and keep the poor ignorant to the knowledge of God and the knowledge of the truth. Bear with me, because it's going to get a little heavier than what it is right now. I would like to warn the leaders, don't do this, because you're making yourself worthy of hell. Just remember, black leaders, what is going on in South Africa. Your brothers in South Africa are trying to get to the real oppressor, but they're killing the buffer to get to the oppressor. And you know who the buffer is? It's these privileged Negroes who become apologists for a system of oppression, a system of apartheid, a system that is unjust. And so I say to all of you, your excuses are ended. Yeah? If you join with the enemies of truth, then you will put yourself into the chastisement of Allah. You will not escape. You will suffer great loss, ruin, and ultimately a disgraceful death if you reject the truth and join with the enemies to condemn a man that only seeks your liberation. I say this very humbly. Please listen. I am your last chance. Listen. black leader that ever stood up for you. You helped to kill your own leaders at the insistence of your open enemy. You can't be charged with it for yesterday because we were ignorant. We were not awake. But today, if you join your enemy to kill a just man, then the pain of what your fathers deserved for killing and betraying Nat Turner, then Mavisi, Gabriel Prosser, Booker T, W.E.B., Marcus Garvey, Noble Drew Ali, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, all of it will come down on this generation. I'm your last chance. God is ending your excuses. You can't say the brother is not articulate. God makes me to make it so plain, even a fool can't miss it. You can't say he's an ugly dude. God makes me pleasant for you to look at. Though I don't consider myself the equal of none of those men that I call, I come at the right time. I come in the fullness of time when it all has to be wrapped up. And because I'm on time, I will be more successful than all those that went before me because the time is right, the season is right, you are right, the conditions are right. We must go free now. Now is the time.
Before Okang goes into the subject of economics, there were several camera stops. We have edited what was recorded to make it as sensible as possible.
I want you to hear what I'm saying, America, because you kill everybody that will give you the truth that will correct your wickedness. But if you make a move toward me, which you have already planned to do, you have sat down, Reagan, with your chiefs of staff to figure out the Farrakhan problem. I'm warning you, Mr. Reagan, and I'm warning the government of America. This body you cannot have. You have killed your last black leader when you killed Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Look, the Jews talk about never again. I'm very sorry. I am your last chance too, Jews. I am your chance. Listen, Jews. This little black boy is your last chance. Why do I say your last chance? Because the scriptures were killing the prophets of God. And if you want to show the world that you are better than your fathers, I am not a prophet, but I come in the footsteps of those worthies. And if you rise up to try to kill me, a man that has told you the truth, then Allah promises you that he will bring to bear on this generation the blood of the righteous, not just from Abel to Zechariah, but from Abel all the way to the last man you killed recently. All of you will be killed outright. Now you want to call me anti-Semitic. Well, if I'm anti-Semitic for talking about the transgression of Jews, then burn your Bibles. Because the Bible from the book of Revelation all the way to Genesis talks about Jewish transgression. Then nobody should read the Bible. It is an anti-Semitic book. Don't read the Quran. The Quran starts off in the second surah talking about the transgressions of Israel. How she altered the word of God, wrote a book with her own hands and gave it to the people as though it's God's book. Now you're a so-called Christian and you have not been shaped in the lifestyle of Jesus. You have been shaped in the lifestyle of hell itself, but Jesus' good name is hanging over you. You have been deceived. Christians looking for a heaven too high and a hell too low and a devil that's too spooky. You've been deceived. And they know that we know. And they know that I am not afraid to tell the truth regardless of the cost. And they know that I will tell it and am telling it. I'm not making this up. Go read your Bible. Jesus condemned them as devils in the plainest language. I say the same today. They have no respect for truth. I watched a rabbi, a devil rabbi. Listen to what I said. A devil rabbi argue with Reverend Butts, coming to defend his position on the basis of a lie. I never called Judaism a gutter religion. I said the practice of lying, stealing, murder, and deceit, and using God's holy name to steal your dirty religion, not the practice of the scripture, practice God's holy name. Do you hear what I'm saying? But they have no respect for the truth. I said Hitler was a wickedly great man. I didn't make a mistake. I know the language. You taught it to me, white folks. Now all of a sudden you got dumb to the meaning of what great is. There was an earthquake in Mexico the other day. It was a severe or major earthquake. Then they upgraded it to 8.1 on the Richter scale, and they called it a great earthquake. Did that mean it was a good one? And so, beloved, the closing part of this lecture has to deal with economics. Brothers and sisters, you will never be free as long as black organizations pay homage to others other than you. Jewish control of black organizations has to... Listen, the old Jewish relationship with black people has to be changed. We don't want to relate to Jews on a master-slave relationship because our time to be free men and women has come and we refuse to compromise. Our black artists got to come back home to us, not under the control of others who suck all the blood from the black community. The artist gets rich and then burns it up in coke because he has no cause to live for bigger than himself. They don't allow black artists to be political, to stand up for their own people. Michael Jackson should take a stand for black people, take a stand for the suffering people of South Africa. Azania, Prince should take a stand. All of our black artists should take a stand, but they can't because they're threatened. If you take a stand, we'll cut your money. Stevie stood up and made a song. Apartheid is wrong, wrong, wrong. And immediately his records were banned in South Africa. And the federal government government is moving in on Stevie, talking about taxes. Why the hell don't you move in on me? I'm waiting on you, IRS, because when you come and you're on your way, I will show you why no black man or woman in America should pay any taxes to a government that will not give us justice. No black people should pay. Why should we pay taxes for a police department that kills our grandmothers, kills our babies, shoots us down, pay the salary of unjust judges, pay for American planes to bomb Tunisia, to bomb Lebanon? Hell no. Brothers and sisters, if you don't stand up, you'll always be the laughing stock of the world. I say, but if we stand up like men, stand up like women, we'll back the enemy up, and Allah will give us victory after victory after victory. Now, in my conclusion, Marcus Garvey wanted us to go back to Africa. Abraham Lincoln wanted the same thing. Marcus Garvey said, Africa, don't run, brothers and sisters. I mean, look, if you go out into the night quiet, believe me, when this message is over, you get uptown, cross town, you're going to feel so good. You won't even be able to sleep because you ain't tired. When you wake up in the morning, go face white folks, they say, did you go to the garden last night? Tell them I was there, baby. And that man don't teach hate. That man teach black people to love one another. Look, brothers and sisters, a few quick points. Garvey said we should go back to Africa. Elijah Muhammad said we should be separated in a state or territory of our own, either here or elsewhere. Let's reason with those two solutions. How many of you in here right now, and I want you to be truthful, would like to return to Africa to build a new nation for yourself? Raise your hand. Okay, now, I would say, as a representative of about 25-30% of this audience, that's not bad. But the rest of you, you don't want to go no place. Wait, listen now. But that's cool. I want to talk to both of you. Listen, please listen now. It's very critical. If America agreed to ship us all back, and we agreed to go, it would take all the navies of the whole world cooperating together for a few generations to get 40 million people back to Africa. The truth of the matter is, there may not be an African government right now that's willing to take all of us, but there are governments that's willing to take some of us. Now listen now, if America said, we know we've treated you wrong, we don't like you, we don't want you, we don't have anything more for you Negroes to do, so we're going to give you Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, it would tear America up. Even though it's just that America let us go, she's too afraid to do that because she's afraid that you may join on to an enemy and remember her evil and come against her, so she don't want to let you go. Now, there's a third alternative. We get $204 billion out of the American economy. That's a lot of money, making us the 14th richest nation on the earth if you compare what we get out of the American economy to the gross national product of the nations of the earth. We're very rich, and we have a potential for great power.